Hey guys, tonight we step back nearly 170 years to an America that would feel utterly alien to your modern senses, a land without light switches, without running water, without the faintest hum of a refrigerator to remind you that civilization exists. Imagine waking not to an alarm clock, but to the insistent crowing of a rooster, your breath visible in the frigid bedroom air, your feet about to touch floorboards so cold they might as well be slabs of ice pulled straight from a frozen pond. This is the 1850s, a decade sandwiched between the fading echoes of the revolutionary generation and the approaching thunder of civil war, and you are about to live an ordinary day within it. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive the week if you apply modern hygiene standards, because soap was a luxury, deodorant didn't exist, and the local doctor might genuinely suggest you swallow mercury to cure a headache. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight, so drop your location and local time in the comments. Whether it's midnight in Chicago or 3 in the morning in London, you're all part of this sleepy little gathering. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your eyes flutter open in the darkness, and for a disorienting moment you have no idea what time it is because of course, there's no glowing digital clock on the nightstand. There is no nightstand, actually. Just a small wooden table holding a candlestick with a stub of tallow that smells faintly of rendered animal fat. The room around you is barely visible. The only light are pale grey suggestions seeping through a window that has no screen and, depending on your family's economic standing, possibly no glass either. Just oiled paper stretched over the frame to keep out the worst of the wind. You're buried under a pile of quilts and wool blankets that your mother or grandmother stitched by hand, and beneath you is a mattress stuffed with corn husks, straw, or if you're slightly more fortunate, feathers collected over years of plucking chickens and geese. The rustling sound it makes when you shift is loud enough to wake the person sleeping beside you, because sharing a bed is not just common, it's expected. Siblings pile together for warmth, travellers at inns sleep 3 or 4 to a mattress with complete strangers, and nobody thinks twice about it. The cold is the first thing that truly registers. Not the mild chill of a house where someone forgot to adjust the thermostat, but a bone-deep, aching cold that makes you want to burrow deeper into your cocoon of blankets and never emerge. The fire in the hearth, or the small cast-iron stove in the corner, if your family has upgraded to that relatively modern technology, died down to embers hours ago, and nobody got up in the night to feed it because firewood is precious and sleep is more precious still. Historians still argue whether average Americans in this era slept in one consolidated block like we do today, or in 2 separate shifts with a wakeful period in between, a pattern called segmented sleep that some scholars believe was common before artificial lighting changed our circadian rhythms. Either way, you've been summoned from slumber by the rooster's crow, by the pale light suggesting dawn is perhaps an hour away, and by an urgent pressure in your bladder that cannot be ignored. This is where modern sensibilities take their first serious hit. You do not pad down a hallway to a porcelain throne with a flush handle and a soft nightlight. You reach under the bed and pull out a chamber pot, a ceramic or metal container that serves as your nighttime toilet and will need to be emptied later, probably by you, probably into a pit behind the house that already smells exactly like you're imagining. The wealthy might have chamber pots decorated with painted flowers, or amusing illustrations on the interior bottom, a little visual joke for your most private moments. The less wealthy make do with whatever holds liquids without leaking. There is no toilet paper, naturally. You might use pages torn from old newspapers, dried corn cobs, or simple rags that get washed and reused. If that last detail made you wince, congratulations. You've just experienced approximately 1% of the daily indignities awaiting you in 1850s America. You swing your legs over the side of the bed and your feet hit the floor, and even though you knew it was coming, the shock of cold wood against bare skin makes you gasp. If you're in a more prosperous household, there might be a small rag rug beside the bed to soften the blow, but even that threadbare rectangle of woven fabric won't do much against the chill radiating up from the ground. Houses in this era sit on stone foundations or wooden piers with crawl spaces beneath, and insulation as a concept barely exists. Wind whistles through gaps in the walls, around window frames, under doors. On the coldest winter mornings you might find frost on the inside of your window glass, delicate crystal patterns that would be beautiful if you weren't shivering so violently your teeth chattered. You fumble for a match, or perhaps you use the more old-fashioned method of striking a flint against steel to create a spark that catches on a bit of charcloth and light that stubby tallow candle on the table. The flame wavers and dances, casting strange shadows across the room, illuminating a space that's probably smaller than your modern bathroom. A bed, a table, perhaps a trunk for storing clothes, a few hooks on the wall for hanging garments. That's likely the entire inventory of furniture. The floor is bare wood. The walls might be whitewashed plaster over lath or simply rough-hewn logs with chinking between them, and the ceiling is low, enough that a tall man has to duck when crossing the room. You pull on yesterday's clothes, because the concept of changing outfits daily hasn't really taken hold yet, especially in rural areas where doing laundry is a monumental undertaking. The shirt or chemise you sleep in becomes the base layer you wear all day. Over that goes more layers. We'll get into the full ordeal of 1850s fashion soon enough, but for now, you just need to be covered enough to head downstairs or outside to begin the morning chores. Because that's the key thing to understand about life in this decade. Nobody wakes up and leisurely sips coffee while scrolling through their phone. You wake up because there is work to do immediately, right now, work that cannot wait another minute because animals need feeding, fires need building, water needs hauling, and the entire functioning of the household depends on human labour performed before the sun fully clears the horizon. If you're a woman or a girl old enough to be useful, which in the 1850s means basically any girl over the age of 5, you're probably heading to the kitchen to start the fire in the cook stove and begin preparing breakfast. If you're a man or a boy, you're heading to the barn to feed the livestock, milk the cows, collect eggs from chickens who do not appreciate being disturbed at this hour, and will absolutely try to peck your hands bloody. In either case, you're moving, you're working, and you're doing it in the dark because sunrise is still just a promise on the eastern horizon. The air outside is crisp in a way that modern air-conditioned existence can't replicate. Simultaneously fresh and full of smells that assault your nostrils. Wood smoke from the chimney, manure from the livestock pen, the earthy scent of damp soil, the faint sweetness of hay stored in the barn loft. Your breath fogs in front of your face as you cross the yard, your feet squishing slightly in mud that seems to be a permanent feature of rural life, regardless of season. Mud in spring from snowmelt, mud in summer from thunderstorms, mud in fall from harvest time rains, mud in winter from the freeze-thaw cycle that never quite lets the ground fully harden. Your shoes, if you're wearing shoes, as many children went barefoot except in the coldest months, are probably already caked with the stuff, and cleaning them is one more task you'll add to the infinite list. Here's a quirky little detail that might make you smile despite the grim morning. Many Americans in this era believed firmly in the health benefits of fresh air, even frigidly cold fresh air. They would intentionally leave windows cracked open even in winter, convinced that stagnant indoor air caused disease. They weren't entirely wrong about the dangers of poor ventilation, but their understanding of germ theory was essentially non-existent. That wouldn't come until later in the century, so the reasoning was based more on the concept of miasma, bad air that carry illness on invisible currents. You might hear your neighbours discussing whether the morning air smelled wholesome or pestilent, using their noses to assess disease risk in a way that seems almost comically misguided now. But here's the thing, they were doing their best with the knowledge available. Historians still argue whether these ventilation practices actually reduced disease transmission or simply made everyone more miserable and cold. The rooster crows again, closer now, and you realise you've been standing in the yard lost in thought, while your fingers grow numb and your livestock grow impatient. Time to move, time to work, time to begin another day in an America that's simultaneously familiar and utterly foreign. The sun is finally peeking above the tree line, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that no Instagram filter could ever capture, because the air is clean, genuinely clean, free from the ambient light pollution and chemical haze of modernity. This is one of the small compensations for all the hardship, the beauty of a world not yet industrialized, where stars blanketed the night sky so thickly it looked like spilled milk, where sunrises unfolded in colours so vivid they made your chest ache. But you don't have time to admire the view. There's work to do. The kitchen you enter is already warming, the cook stove beginning to radiate heat from the fire someone started just moments ago. If you're the first one up, and in many households, women rise even before the roosters, then you're the one who had to coax that fire to life. And let me tell you, that is not a simple matter of turning a dial or pressing a button. You knelt before the cast iron beast. opened the firebox door, raked out last night's ashes into a metal bucket that you'll later dump in the yard, and carefully arranged kindling over whatever embers remained. If the embers were dead, you struck a match, those newfangled friction matches that seemed like miracles of modern technology when they first appeared, and prayed the kindling caught before your fingers burned. Then you added larger sticks, then small logs, adjusting the damper and the air vents to control airflow, reading the fire's behaviour like a language you've been learning since childhood. Too much air and the fire roars dangerously, overheating the stovetop and risking setting the whole house ablaze. Too little air and the fire smothers, smoking sullenly and refusing to heat your cookware. The cast iron cook stove is actually a relatively recent innovation in the 1850s, and not everyone has one. Many families still cook over an open hearth, which is arguably even more dangerous and definitely more labour-intensive. The hearth requires constant tending, heavy iron pots suspended from hooks or resting on trivets, and the cook must lean over open flames while wearing long skirts made of cotton or wool, fabrics that catch fire with horrifying ease. House fires caused by cooking accidents killed thousands of American women every year, and severe burns were so common that most families knew at least one woman who bore the scars. The cook stove contained the fire more safely, directed heat more efficiently, and allowed for multiple cooking surfaces at different temperatures. But it was expensive, heavy, and required a working knowledge of metallurgy and thermodynamics that would be passed from mother to daughter through years of patient instruction. You check the water reservoir built into the side of the stove, a feature that some models include to provide a constant supply of warm water for washing dishes and hands. If it's getting low, you make a mental note to refill it from the bucket by the door, the bucket that someone hauled from the well or the spring earlier, water weighing over 8 pounds per gallon, carried in wooden or metal containers that might hold 2 to 5 gallons at a time. That's 16 to 40 pounds of water per trip, multiple trips per day, every plus per week, single day forever. Your biceps would be phenomenal. Your back would be destroyed by age 40. The smells filling the kitchen are difficult to describe to modern senses because they're simultaneously appetizing and slightly off-putting. The dominant note is wood smoke, always wood smoke that permeates everything, your clothes, your hair, your food, the very walls of the house. Underneath that is the warm, yeasty smell of bread dough if anyone started a sponge the night before. The sharp tang of the vinegar crock where pickles are slowly transforming in their brine. The meaty richness of salt pork or bacon, waiting to be sliced and fried. But there's also a faint undertone of something not quite fresh, because refrigeration doesn't exist and keeping food from spoiling is a constant battle involving salt, smoke, sugar, vinegar and prayer. You reach for the cast iron skillet that lives on the stovetop, its surface gleaming with a patina of accumulated fat from thousands of previous meals. This skillet will never be washed with soap, that would strip the seasoning that makes it naturally non-stick, only wiped clean with a rag or scrubbed with coarse salt if something particularly stubborn has adhered. Some families pass down their skillets through generations, these humble cooking implements becoming heirlooms as prized as any piece of jewellery. The weight of the thing is substantial, maybe 5 or 6 pounds for a full-size skillet, and you handle it with the casual strength of someone who has been lifting heavy objects since childhood. Into the skillet goes a slice of salt pork, that staple of the 1850s American diet that kept families fed through winters when fresh meat was unavailable. Salt pork is exactly what it sounds like. Pork belly packed in barrels of salt to preserve it, emerging months later as an intensely salty, somewhat funky-tasting protein source that needs to be soaked in water before cooking to leach out some of the brine. The fat renders, out in the hot skillet, popping and sizzling, filling the kitchen with the smell that would later become associated with bacon. Though salt pork is fattier, saltier, and less smoky than the bacon you know. This rendered fat is liquid gold in the 1850s kitchen, saved in a crock by the stove to be used for frying, baking, seasoning, and even spreading on bread in place of butter when the butter has run out. While the salt pork renders, you might crack some eggs into the fat if you have eggs available. Your chickens are laying regularly. The family with the neighbouring farm hasn't been struck by any of the mysterious diseases that periodically decimated poultry flocks, and nobody has had to trade the eggs for something more urgently needed. Fresh eggs are a luxury that many families enjoy only in spring and summer, when the hens are most productive. In winter, hens slow or stop laying entirely, And preserved eggs, rubbed with fat or packed in lime water to seal the shells, are the only option, though they taste noticeably different and don't perform as well in baking. Here's a culinary detail that might make you appreciate your modern breakfast. Baking powder as we know it wasn't really commercially available until the 1830s, and even then it was expensive and not universally trusted. Before that, cooks who wanted fluffy biscuits or risen cakes had to use pearl ash, saleratus, or cream of tartar combined with baking soda, often measuring by instinct rather than standardized recipes. The results were inconsistent, sometimes perfectly risen, sometimes flat as a pancake, sometimes left with a strange chemical aftertaste that made you pucker. Getting baked goods to come out right was considered a genuine skill, and young women were judged harshly by their ability to produce light, tender biscuits. A heavy biscuit could genuinely hurt your marriage prospects. This is not a joke. The ability to cook and bake well was considered essential to being a suitable wife, and men, and their mothers, evaluated potential brides on such criteria with the calculating scrutiny of a cattle auction. You pull cornmeal from the barrel in the corner, assuming weevils haven't gotten into it again, those tiny beetles whose larvae wriggle through stored grains and whose presence you've learned to accept as inevitable rather than disgusting. You sift the cornmeal through your fingers, picking out the worst of the debris, and mix it with water and a pinch of salt to make cornmeal mush, the breakfast staple that fueled millions of American mornings. This might be fried in the fat left over from the salt pork, creating a crispy exterior and soft interior, or it might be boiled into a porridge-like consistency and served with molasses, that thick, dark sweetener that was far more common than refined white sugar because it was cheap, produced domestically from Louisiana cane fields, and packed with a robust flavour that could mask the taste of lesser ingredients. Speaking of sugar, if your family has white sugar at all, it came in a solid cone called a sugar loaf, wrapped in distinctive blue paper, weighing anywhere from 5 to 15 pounds. Using it required nipping off chunks with special sugar-cutting shears or a hammer and chisel, then crushing those chunks into usable granules with a mortar and pestle. The result was never as uniform as modern granulated sugar, with some crystals large and crunchy and others powder-fine. Brown sugar was cheaper, being less refined, and most families used it for everyday cooking, while reserving the white stuff for company or special occasions. Historians estimate that the average American in this decade consumed around 15 to 20 pounds of sugar per year, compared to over 100 pounds annually for modern Americans. But that doesn't mean people didn't crave sweetness. They satisfied that craving with molasses, maple syrup, honey and dried fruits, layering sweeteners into dishes in ways that sometimes seem excessive to modern palates. The children have begun stirring upstairs, their footsteps creaking across the floorboards, their sleepy voices carrying down through the thin plaster ceiling. Soon they'll tumble into the kitchen, still rubbing their eyes, still wearing the same clothes they wore yesterday and will wear tomorrow. And they'll be hungry because growing children are always hungry and the meals are hours apart, and substantial snacking isn't really a thing when food preservation is this difficult. You'll feed them before they head out to their chores. Even the youngest ones have tasks. Even the 5-year-old has been assigned to scatter feed for the chickens, or collect kindling or watch the toddler, so the older children can do more demanding work. You realise as you haven't yet had your coffee, and the thought produces a craving so intense it almost hurts. Coffee in the 1850s is a revelation and a disappointment all at once. The beans arrive green, unroasted, requiring you to roast them yourself in a sillet over the fire. A process that fills the house with an intoxicating aroma, but it is easy to get wrong, leaving you with either under-roasted beans that taste like grass, or over-roasted beans that taste like charcoal. Once roasted, the beans must be ground using a hand-cranked mill that takes genuine physical effort, producing grounds of wildly inconsistent size that brew unevenly. The coffee is then boiled with water in a pot, sometimes with the grounds just floating freely, sometimes contained in a cloth bag, and the result is strong, bitter, often muddy with sediment, and utterly essential to facing the day ahead. Some people add milk if they have a cow producing, molasses for sweetness, or even an egg white to clarify the brew. A quirky practice. Some households threw a whole fish skin into the coffee pot, claiming it improved the flavour. Historians still debate whether this was widespread or merely an eccentric regional practice, but the fact that anyone did it at all tells you something about the experimental desperation of 1850s cooking. You pour yourself a cup, wrap both hands around its warmth and take a sip that burns your tongue because you're impatient, and the coffee is boiling hot, and there's no temperature-controlled mug to keep it at the perfect drinking temperature. The bitterness is intense, the caffeine hitting your exhausted system like a gentle slap. And for just a moment you stand still in the warming kitchen, watching the fire flicker through the grate of the cook stove, listening to the children's feet on the stairs, feeling the weight of the day ahead settle onto your shoulders. Breakfast is nearly ready, the family is gathering. The sun is fully up now, golden light streaming through the wavy glass of the kitchen window. And for all the hardship of this life, there's something undeniably lovely about a meal shared with people you love, food you prepared with your own hands, morning light that costs nothing and arrives reliably every single day. But you don't have time to be philosophical. The eggs are done and the children are hungry. The family gathers around the table, a rough-hewn piece of furniture that might seat anywhere from 4 to 12, depending on the household's size and prosperity. And for a moment, there's the familiar chaos of everyone finding their places. The youngest children sit on benches rather than individual chairs, squeezed together with elbows competing for space, while the father takes his seat at the head of the table in the only chair with armrests, a subtle but unmistakable symbol of household hierarchy. Mother sits at the opposite end, nearest the stove, because she'll be up and down throughout the meal, fetching forgotten items, refilling coffee, adjusting the fire. The food before you is Harmsy in the sense that it's filling rather than refined. That cornmeal mush you prepared is piled in a communal bowl, steam rising from its grainy surface. The salt pork, sliced and fried until the edges curled and crisped, sits on a chipped ceramic platter. If there are eggs, they're fried hard. Soft cooked eggs don't keep you full through a morning of physical labour the way a solid, rubbery yolk does. There might be bread if someone baked recently, or biscuits if time and ingredients allowed, or simply more cornmeal in the form of johnny cakes or hoe cakes cooked on a griddle. Butter appears in a small crock, pale yellow in summer when the cows eat fresh grass, nearly white in winter when they're fed dried hay, and you spread it sparingly because butter represents hours of churning labour and doesn't keep long even in a cool cellar. Before anyone takes a bite, heads bow for grace. Religion permeates daily life in the 1850s in ways that feel almost foreign to secular modern sensibilities. The prayer might be a standard formula, bless this food to our bodies and us to thy service. Or it might be a longer, more personal supplication depending on the family's denomination and the father's inclination toward oratory. Either way, no food is consumed until God has been thanked for providing it, and woe to the child whose eager hand reaches for a biscuit before the final amen. Now you eat, and here's where things get interesting from a sensory perspective. The salt pork is intensely, almost shockingly salty. Your modern palate, accustomed to low-sodium options and carefully calibrated seasoning, would probably recoil at the first bite. But salt serves essential functions beyond flavour. It's a preservative, an appetite stimulant, and in an era when people sweat through heavy physical labour all day long, a necessary replacement for electrolytes lost through exertion. Workers might consume tablespoons of salt daily and still crave more. The cornmeal mush, by contrast, is bland. The corn flavour earthy and simple, the texture ranging from creamy to grainy depending on how finely the meal was ground. You add, say, molasses, that thick ribbon of darkness that transforms plainness into something approaching enjoyable, and suddenly the mush is both sweet and substantial, a combination that will stick to your ribs through hours of labour. The coffee washes everything down, still too hot, still bitter enough to make your face scrunch on each sip, but essential nonetheless. Children might drink milk instead, if there's milk available and it hasn't soured, an ever-present risk in the days before pasteurisation. Soured milk isn't wasted, of course. It becomes clabber, a thick yogurt-like substance that some people actually enjoy, or it's fed to pigs who'll eat anything, or it's used in baking where the acidity helps activate leavening agents. Nothing is wasted. The concept of throwing away food would strike an 1850s housewife as not just wasteful, but almost sinful. Let's talk about variety for a moment, or more accurately, the lack thereof. If you're eating breakfast in the 1850s, especially in a rural household, you're probably eating some variation of this same meal day after day after day. Cornmeal mush might become corn pone, might become corn pudding, but the fundamental ingredient remains identical. Salt pork gives way to bacon or ham depending on how recently the family slaughtered a hog, but the preserved pork product category dominates. Eggs come and go with the chicken's productivity. Biscuits, bread, or some other flour-based carbohydrate rounds things out. Fruits and vegetables are seasonal luxuries. A bowl of stewed apples in autumn, dried apple slices in winter, fresh berries in summer if you have time to pick them, and they haven't been devoured by birds first. The wealthy, of course, eat differently. In a prosperous household in Boston or New York or Charleston, breakfast might include beefsteak, fried potatoes, rolls with butter and jam, eggs prepared in multiple styles, fresh fruit from hothouse gardens, and coffee served from a silver service with a matching cream pitcher and sugar bowl. The gap between what the wealthy ate and what ordinary Americans consumed was vast, far more pronounced than the difference today between, say, a working-class breakfast of cereal and a wealthy person's avocado toast. Diet was perhaps the single most visible marker of class distinction, and the health consequences were real. Wealthy children with access to varied nutrition grew taller and stronger than their poor counterparts, a disparity visible in military records and census data from the era. Here's a mainstream historical fact that might surprise you. The average American man in the 1850s stood about 5 feet 7 inches tall, roughly 2 inches shorter than the average modern American man, largely due to the nutritional deficiencies of a diet heavy on preserved meats and corn and light on fresh vegetables and proteins. The average woman was correspondingly shorter, and both sexes looked older than their years due to hard labour, poor dental care, and limited health care. A 40-year-old farm wife might be missing half her teeth, her skin weathered and lined, her hands calloused to the texture of leather. This wasn't negligence or vanity, it was simply what life did to a body. And yet, the people eating this humble breakfast are not unhappy in the way you might expect. Contentment is relative, and they know no other way of living. The father making a joke about the rooster that crowed too early, the mother shushing the youngest child who's drumming on the table with a spoon, the older children discussing the day's tasks. This is the warmth of family life, unchanged across centuries. The food is plain but abundant. No one goes hungry at this table, and that's more than many can say. The roof doesn't leak too badly, the fire is warm, and spring is coming with its promise of fresh greens and baby animals and longer days. Historians often struggle to capture this quotidian contentment because it doesn't generate dramatic records the way hardship and tragedy do, but it existed nonetheless, woven through ordinary days like the comforting pattern of a familiar quilt. Breakfast ends not with leisurely lingering, but with an abrupt return to duty. Plates are scraped, nothing left behind, every scrap consumed, and stacked for washing later. The table is wiped down, the younger children are shooed toward their tasks, and within minutes the kitchen that felt so briefly like a haven becomes just another workspace. You grab your shawl or your coat, depending on the season, and head back out into the world where the real labour awaits. A quirky detail before we move on. Many families in the 1850s believed firmly that drinking cold water with a meal was dangerous to digestion. Room temperature or warm beverages were preferred, and gulping down a glass of cold well water after eating was thought to shock the stomach and cause cramps, indigestion, or worse. This belief persisted in various forms into the 20th century and still surfaces occasionally today in certain folk medicine traditions. Whether it had any physiological basis is unclear. Historians and nutritionists still argue about whether temperature of beverages meaningfully affects digestion, but it shaped daily behaviour in ways small but consistent. You pause at the door, looking back at the kitchen, where the fire still crackles and the last wisps of coffee steam rise from the pot. Your stomach is full, your hands are warm, and somewhere inside you there's a small sturdy satisfaction in having fed your family another meal. It's not glamorous, this life, it's repetitive and exhausting and occasionally monotonous beyond belief, but it's yours, every cornmeal-laden, coffee-fueled morning of it, and there's something to be said for knowing exactly what each day will bring. Even if what it brings is more cornmeal mush. Now comes the part of the morning that modern people dramatically underestimate. Getting dressed. You might think, how complicated could it be? You pull on some clothes and go about your day. But in the 1850s, clothing is an engineering project, a physical challenge, and a social statement all wrapped into layers upon layers of fabric that can take 30 minutes or more to properly arrange. Start with women. because their ordeal is significantly more elaborate. If you're a woman in this decade, you wake already wearing a chemise, a simple loose-fitting garment of cotton or linen that serves as both nightwear and the foundation layer of daytime dress. You don't change this chemise daily. It might be worn for a week or more before washing, absorbing sweat and body oils that would otherwise soil your more expensive outer garments. Over the chemise goes the corset, and here's where modern misconceptions need correcting. The 1850s corset is not the extreme waist-cinching torture device of later Victorian fashion. It's a structured undergarment made of sturdy cotton, or linen, reinforced with channels of cording or thin strips of whalebone, actually baleen, the keratin plates from a whale's mouth, that provide support rather than severe compression. Think of it more like a very rigid bra that extends to your hips, offering back support, shaping the torso, and providing attachment points for other garments. Most women considered their corsets comfortable, even essential, and would have felt undressed and unsupported without them. The genuinely painful tight lacing you've heard about was a fashion extreme practiced by some urban wealthy women, not the everyday experience of the farmer's wife or the shopkeeper's daughter. You pull the corset around your torso, or have someone help you, because reaching all those hooks and laces behind your back is genuinely difficult, and tighten the laces until you feel supported but not constricted. Over this goes a corset cover, a simple layer that protects the corset from wear and creates a smooth surface for the next layers. Then comes the petticoat, or more likely multiple petticoats. In the 1850s, the fashionable silhouette featured a wide bell-shaped skirt, and achieving that shape without modern crinolines, which were just starting to appear mid-decade, required layering 3, 4, even 5 petticoats one atop another. Each petticoat might be made of cotton, wool, or flannel depending on the season, and together they add considerable weight and bulk to your lower body. The skirt itself goes over all these petticoats, usually a separate garment from the bodice rather than an integrated dress. This allows for mixing and matching, extending your wardrobe's apparent variety, though the practical options are still limited. Bodices button or hook up the front, a relatively recent convenience, as earlier fashions often fastened in back and required assistance, and sleeves might be detachable, allowing you to change just the sleeves to alter your look or to remove them for heavy housework that would soil or strain the fabric. The fabrics themselves deserve attention. Cotton is increasingly common thanks to the booming southern cotton industry, and yes, we'll talk about the enslaved people whose forced labour made that cotton available, because you cannot discuss the 1850s honestly without confronting that horror. Wool remains essential for warmth, though it's scratchy against the skin, and requires that linen or cotton chemise beneath. Silk is for the wealthy only, or for special occasions that warrant bringing out a cherished garment worn only a few times per decade. Linen, once the dominant fabric for undergarments, is being overtaken by cheaper cotton, and everything wrinkles, stains and tears more easily than modern synthetic blends. Now consider this: there is no elastic, no zippers, no velcro. Every closure is a button, a hook and eye, a tie or a lace. Getting dressed is genuinely time-consuming, requiring fine motor skills and patience, and getting undressed at night reverses the whole tedious process. Spontaneity in dress is not a thing that exists. For men, the ordeal is somewhat simpler, but still involves far more than modern jeans and a t-shirt. You wake in your nightshirt, yes, men wore nightshirts, long garments reaching below the knee, and exchange it for a day shirt made of cotton or linen, cut generously with long tails that tuck into the trousers. These shirts don't have attached collars. The collar is a separate piece, often stiffened with starch, that attaches with collar studs. Changing just the collar allows you to maintain a fresh, clean appearance around your face, even when the shirt beneath has been worn for several days. Trousers in the 1850s sit high on the natural waist and are held up by suspenders. Belts exist, but are less common for everyday wear, with buttons for the fly closure. Underwear as we know it is minimal, perhaps a linen or cotton undergarment called drawers, but many men, especially working-class men, simply wore their long shirt tail tucked between their legs and considered that sufficient. A vest or waistcoat adds another layer and provides pockets for watch, coins and other small essentials. And over all this goes a coat or jacket if you're going out, or perhaps just shirt sleeves if you're staying home and working. Here's a historical detail that might make you smile. Ready-made clothing was just beginning to become available in the 1850s. Manufactured in standard sizes and sold in stores, but it was considered inferior to homemade or tailor-made garments. A man wearing an obviously ready-made suit was advertising his lower economic status as clearly as a logo on a cheap knockoff bag does today. The fit was often poor, the fabric quality questionable, and the construction shoddy. Skilled tailors and home sewers who could produce well-fitted, durable clothing were valued members of their communities. Children dressed as miniature adults, with some concessions, to practicality. Young boys might wear dresses until age 4 or 5, a tradition that had nothing to do with gender expression and everything to do with the practicality of diapering and toileting small children. After breeching, boys transitioned to trousers and began dressing like their fathers. Girls graduated from simple short dresses to longer skirts and more structured bodices as they approached adolescence, their clothing increasingly mimicking their mother's styles. The fabrics against your skin are rougher than anything you're accustomed to. Even well-washed cotton retains a certain coarseness, and wool ranges from merely scratchy to genuinely abrasive depending on quality. Clothing rubs, chafes, itches. You develop calluses not just on hands and feet, but where fabric meets skin at pressure points. The concept of clothing specifically designed for comfort, soft cotton tees, jersey knits, fleece, simply doesn't exist. You dress for durability, for warmth, for modesty. For social appropriateness, and comfort comes a distant fifth if it's considered at all. Historians still argue about how body odour was perceived in an era before daily bathing and effective deodorants became standard. Some scholars suggest that people simply didn't notice their own smell or others because everyone smelled. It was the baseline. Others propose that strong scents, including body odour, were actually considered more honest and natural than the artificial perfumes increasingly available. What we know for certain is that bathing was infrequent, more on that later. Washing clothes was exhausting and done as seldom as possible, and the 1850s American you've now become smells in ways that would stop a modern elevator conversation cold. You're finely dressed 15, 20, 30 minutes after waking depending on your gender and the complexity of your clothing, and ready to face the day. You feel the weight of the layers, the constriction of the corset if you're a woman, the stiffness of the collar if you're a man. You move slightly differently in these clothes, more carefully, more deliberately. You cannot flop onto furniture. You must lower yourself gracefully or risk crushing petticoats or popping buttons. You cannot sprawl, you must maintain posture. Your clothing shapes your body language, your movements, your very sense of self. And you're all just getting started with the morning chores. You step out the door and into a farmyard that assaults your senses with its full frontal reality. The air is thick with the smell of animals, horses, cattle, pigs, chickens, maybe goats or sheep depending on the region and the family's means. And while this might sound quaint and pastoral, the actual odour is pungent enough to make your eyes water. Animal waste piles up faster than anyone can shovel it, drawing flies in summer and freezing into treacherous mounds in winter. Your shoes squelch through a combination of mud and manure that will cling to your soles until you scrape it off on the iron boot scraper by the door, and even then you'll track traces inside. The farmstead itself spreads around you. The main house with its smoking chimney, a barn of weathered wood where livestock shelter and hay is stored, perhaps a separate chicken coop, definitely an outhouse, set at a discreet distance from the living quarters, maybe a smokehouse for preserving meat, a spring house or root cellar for keeping things cool, various sheds and outbuildings accumulated over years of need. Nothing is painted. Paint is expensive and labour-intensive, so everything has weathered to shades of silver grey and brown, harmonising with the landscape in ways that modern suburban homes, with their garish siding and chemical green lawns, never achieve. Your first task is probably animal-related. The cows need milking, an activity that occurs twice daily, morning and evening, without fail, regardless of weather, illness or personal inclination. You settle onto a three-legged stool beside a warm bovine flank. Press your forehead against her side for stability, grasp the teats, and begin the rhythmic squeeze and pull motion that sends streams of warm milk hissing into the wooden bucket below. This takes skill. Cows will not let down their milk for just anyone, and a nervous or impatient milker can cause a cow to kick, refuse to produce, or step directly into the bucket, ruining the entire morning's work. The smell of fresh milk mingles with the smell of cow and hay, and your own morning sweat, creating an olfactory cocktail unique to dairy farming. The chickens need feeding and their eggs need collecting, a task that seems simple until you realise that chickens are essentially small, feathered dinosaurs with sharp beaks and no respect for your fingers. You scatter grain in the yard, watching the birds rush toward it with that peculiar head-bobbing gait, then venture into the coop to raid the nesting boxes. Some hens yield their eggs peacefully. Others peck viciously at your invading hand, leaving welts and occasionally drawing blood. You learn to approach broody hens with a cloth wrapped around your hand, or to time your collections for when the hens are distracted by food. A good laying hen might produce an egg every day or two during peak season, but egg production drops dramatically in winter when daylight hours shorten, leaving you to ration your supplies or preserve eggs for lean times. The pigs need feeding too, and pigs are remarkable animals, intelligent, omnivorous, and capable of converting household scraps into bacon with reasonable efficiency. Their pen is a churned mess of mud and worse, and you dump kitchen scraps, spoiled milk, garden waste, and whatever else is on hand into their trough, watching them devour everything with grunting enthusiasm. Pigs were essential to 1850s farm economy because they required minimal pasture, ate things nothing else would touch, and provided an enormous return in meat, fat, and leather. A family might slaughter 1 or 2 pigs each autumn, a community event involving neighbours helping neighbours in exchange for shares of the meat, and the resulting pork would be salted, smoked, or otherwise preserved to last through the year. Horses or oxen need tending if your farm is large enough to require draft animals for ploughing and hauling. These are valuable investments. A good horse could cost what a worker might earn in 6 months, and their care is proportionally careful. You bring them water in heavy buckets, you fork hay into their mangers, you check their hooves for stones or signs of disease. If a horse goes lame, you've lost your ability to plough, to haul, to travel any distance beyond walking range. Veterinary care exists in a rudimentary form, but for serious conditions you're often on your own with folk remedies and prayer. The well is your next stop, that essential shaft dug into the earth where water accumulates from underground sources. You drop, the bucket down, listening for the splash that tells you the water level is adequate, and begin cranking it back up on a windlass, arm muscles straining against the weight. If your well is shallow and the rope directly attached, you haul hand over hand, which builds impressive upper body strength and impressive calluses. The water comes up cold and clear, usually, though contamination from nearby outhouses, animal pens, or simply improperly sealed well walls was a constant danger that people didn't fully understand. Waterborne diseases, typhoid, cholera, dysentery, killed more Americans in the 1850s than almost any other cause, and the connection between contaminated water and illness was only beginning to be recognised by forward-thinking doctors and scientists. Here's a quirky detail. Some families kept live fish in their wells, believing that if the fish stayed alive and healthy, the water was safe to drink. This was actually a surprisingly reasonable early water quality test, as fish are sensitive to many contaminants that would also harm humans. Of course, the fish couldn't detect everything, and plenty of wells that kept fish alive still harboured cholera bacteria or other invisible threats. But the impulse toward testing, toward verification, shows that people weren't blindly trusting their water supplies. They just lacked the microscopes and germ theory to know what they should really be testing for. You carry the water back to the house in buckets suspended from a yoke across your shoulders, a carrying method that distributes the weight more evenly than arm hauling, but still leaves you sore and exhausted. This trip might happen 3, 4, 5 times daily, depending on household needs. Water for cooking, water for washing dishes, water for livestock who drink far more than humans do, water for laundry when laundry day arrives, water for the occasional bath, water for cleaning, water for everything. Historians estimate that a typical farm family used between 50 and 100 gallons of water daily, all of it hauled by human muscle from source to point of use. The sun has risen properly now, and the farmyard is bright with morning light that reveals every detail of this hardscrabble existence. The paint-bare buildings, the mud and manure, the livestock moving in their pens, the smoke rising from the chimney where your mother or wife or sisters are continuing the kitchen work inside. Sweat has already dampened your shirt despite the cool morning air, and your hands are grimy from animal contact and bucket handling. You'll wash them before eating anything. That much basic hygiene has penetrated even to remote farms, but your standard of clean would not satisfy modern expectations. Someone calls your name from the house. Breakfast was finished a while ago, and there's more work to discuss, tasks to assign, a whole day stretching ahead with its endless demands. You take one more look around the farmyard, this little kingdom of mud and animals that your family has carved from the American wilderness, and feel something complicated. Pride, maybe, in what you've built and maintained. Exhaustion, certainly, because you've already worked harder this morning than many modern Americans work in a day. And somewhere beneath it all, the bone-deep understanding that this is simply life, neither better nor worse than expected, just the way things are. You head toward the house, boots heavy with mud, bucket heavy with water, mind already turning toward the next task. Let's linger on water for a moment longer, because understanding the 1850s relationship with water is understanding the fundamental rhythm of daily survival. Water wasn't something you thoughtlessly turned on with a faucet. It was a resource as precious and labour-intensive as any crop you grew. Every drop that touched your skin, entered your mouth, cleaned your clothes, or cooked your food came from somewhere specific. Oh, well, a spring, a stream, a cistern collecting rainwater, and getting it to where you needed it required relentless physical effort. If your farm was fortunate enough to have a spring, a natural upwelling of groundwater, you might build a spring house over it, a small stone or wooden structure that kept the water protected and cool. Inside the spring house you could store crocks of butter, pails of milk, and other perishables, taking advantage of the constant cool temperature that natural underground water maintains. This was 1850s refrigeration, a small damp room where temperatures hovered in the 50s or 60s year-round, enough to slow spoilage though never to stop it entirely. Most families, however, relied on wells. Digging a well was a major undertaking, potentially dangerous if the walls collapsed, or if you struck rock before reaching the water table. Successful wells were assets that increased a property's value significantly. Failed wells were expensive disappointments that might need to be abandoned and new ones dug elsewhere. The depth of wells varied wildly depending on geography, 15 feet in some areas, 60 feet or more in others, and deeper wells meant harder water hauling every single time. Urban Americans, increasingly numerous as cities grew throughout the 1850s, faced different water challenges. Public wells and pumps served neighborhoods, with lines forming each morning as housewives and servants waited their turn to fill buckets. The water quality was often questionable at best, as urban groundwater became contaminated by the very density of human habitation it served. Industrial waste, human waste, animal waste, and simply the accumulated filth of thousands of people living close together seeped into aquifers and poisoned the supply that everyone depended upon. Cities began constructing public water systems during this era, perhaps the most ambitious engineering projects of their time. New York's Croton Aqueduct, completed in 1842, carried water from reservoirs 40 miles north of the city, and similar projects were underway or planned in Boston, Philadelphia, and other growing metropolises. Having piped water delivered to your home was a luxury that marked you as distinctly upper class. It cost money for the service and required indoor plumbing that most buildings lacked. But the existence of these systems, even in limited form, pointed toward a future where the back-breaking labour of water hauling might eventually end. Back on the farm, though, that future remains distant. You continue hauling morning and evening, in rain and snow and blistering summer heat. Your shoulders develop permanent ridges from the weight of the yoke. Your hands grow rough from the friction of bucket handles and rope. And you never ever take water for granted, because you understand viscerally what it costs to make it available. The water you drink is different from modern tap water in ways subtle and profound. It hasn't been chlorinated, fluoridated, or otherwise treated. It carries whatever minerals exist in the local soil, hard water in limestone country, soft water elsewhere, and those minerals affect everything from how soap is to how your tea tastes. It might carry sediment, tiny particles visible when you hold a glass to the light, which you've learned to ignore, and it might carry invisible passengers, bacteria, parasites, viruses, that you have no way to detect and no real way to protect against except by luck. Historians still argue about how aware 1850s Americans were of waterborne disease risks. The germ theory of disease wouldn't be fully established until later in the century, but observational evidence had accumulated over generations. People noticed that epidemics often followed flooding, that certain wells or streams seemed to cause sickness more than others, that boiling water or making it into tea seemed safer than drinking it cold. These observations didn't coalesce into scientific understanding, but they informed behaviour nonetheless. One remarkable example. During cholera epidemics, Some communities noticed that beer drinkers got sick less often than water drinkers. The reason we now know was that the brewing process killed cholera bacteria, making beer, even weak, low-alcohol beer, safer than the local water supply. This observation led some temperance advocates to desperate contortions, trying to explain why God would spare the sinful drinkers while punishing the virtuous water drinkers. The answer had nothing to do with divine judgment and everything to do with microbiology, but that explanation lay decades in the future. Bathing in this era was infrequent by modern standards. We'll explore this more later. But when you did bathe, the water had to be hauled, heated on the stove and poured into a tub, usually a small portable wooden or metal affair that could be set up in the kitchen near the warm stove. You might get 2 or 3 inches of warm water in the bottom, enough to sit in with your knees drawn up, and you washed as quickly as possible before the water cooled to uncomfortable temperatures. The same water might serve multiple family members in order of hierarchy, father first, then mother, then children from oldest to youngest, each person entering water that was progressively cooler and dirtier. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It wasn't just a saying. It was practical advice when the baby bathed last, and the water was murky enough to lose something in. You're becoming acutely aware, living this life, of how much a modern infrastructure stands between you and the raw necessities of survival. Every time you wash your hands in your 21st century life, you're benefiting from water treatment plants, pressurized delivery systems, sewer systems, water heaters, and hundreds of years of engineering that transformed water from a precious, precarious resource into something so abundant you literally flush it down the toilet. In the 1850s, you are the infrastructure. Your muscles, your time, your labour, that's what separates your family from thirst. And you do it again and again and again, day after day, bucket after bucket, until water hauling becomes as automatic as breathing. You stop thinking about it consciously. Your body simply knows when the buckets are low, when the reservoir needs filling, when the animals need their troughs replenished. It becomes part of the rhythm of existence, as natural and as relentless as the rising of the sun. The well bucket drops into darkness one more time. You hear the splash, you begin to crank. If you thought water was challenging, let me introduce you to laundry day. Widely acknowledged even by 1850 standards as the most physically demanding regular task of domestic life. The very phrase laundry day suggests something contained, a single day's work, but this is somewhat misleading. The labour often began the day before with preparation and could extend the day after with ironing, making it more accurately a laundry ordeal that consumed the middle of every week. In most households, Monday was wash day. This wasn't arbitrary, it followed a logic rooted in the weekly cycle. Sunday was for church and rest, more on that later, so Saturday was for cleaning the house and preparing for the Sabbath. By Monday, the house was as orderly as it would get, and the week's dirty laundry had accumulated sufficiently to justify the massive labour investment. Everything, and I mean everything, about washing clothes in the 1850s was more difficult than you're imagining. The day before wash day, you sorted clothes by type and soil level, because different fabrics required different treatments. White linens would be boiled, coloured cottons washed more gently to prevent dye from running. Woolens required cold water and minimal agitation to avoid shrinking and felting. You also had to make sure you had enough soap, either purchased from a general store, or, more commonly in rural areas, made at home from rendered animal fat and lye. Homemade soap production was its own subset of domestic labour. You saved cooking grease and fat scraps for months, storing them in containers that grew increasingly rancid. When you had enough fat accumulated, you mixed it with lye, a caustic alkaline solution made by filtering water through hardwood ashes, and cooked the mixture over an outdoor fire, stirring with a long stick to avoid being splashed by the caustic spattering brew. The chemical reaction, called saponification, gradually transformed fat and lye into soap over hours of cooking, and the result was a soft, brownish substance that smelled of its origins and could strip the skin off your hands if you weren't careful. This soap was effective but harsh, nothing like the gentle moisturising bars of modern bathrooms. On wash day itself, you rose even earlier than usual because water needed hauling and heating before dawn gave way to the main work. Massive quantities of water were required. Estimates suggest a family's laundry might need over 50 gallons, every drop hauled from the well and heated over the fire. You filled large copper or iron kettles suspended over outdoor fires or crammed onto the cook stove, heating water to near boiling for the first wash. The kitchen or the yard became a steam-filled sauna, humid and oppressive regardless of the outdoor temperature. The actual washing began with the dirtiest, most heavily soiled items. Work clothes caked with mud and sweat. Baby clothes stained with the inevitable products of baby care. Kitchen cloths greasy from their service. These went into the hottest water with the most soap and you scrubbed them against a washboard. That corrugated wooden or metal surface that you've probably seen in museums or antique shops. The washboard's ridges provided friction to loosen dirt, but they also chafed your knuckles raw. Wash day hands were a recognized condition. Red, cracked, bleeding from hours of immersion, hot water and abrasive soap, pressing fabric against ridged surfaces until the soil released. After scrubbing came wringing, another task that sounds simple and absolutely isn't. You twisted each garment to extract water, using every ounce of upper body strength you possessed. Heavy items like wool blankets or canvas work pants could weigh 20, 30 pounds when waterlogged, and wringing them required either two people twisting in opposite directions or the use of a mechanical wringer, a device with two rollers between which you fed fabric, cranking a handle to squeeze water out. Mechanical wringers were becoming available in the 1850s, so some studies, but they were expensive and not universally owned. Many families still relied on hand wringing, which was exhausting and never got the fabric quite as dry. Rinsing required fresh water, which meant more hauling, more heating, more waiting. You might rinse items once, twice, 3 times until the water ran clear and no soap residue remained. Soap left in fabric was stiff and irritating, and over time would break down fibres and cause clothes to wear out faster. Thorough rinsing was tedious but essential. Bluing was a curious additional step for white items. You added a small amount of blue dye to the final rinse water, a counterintuitive choice that actually made whites appear whiter by counteracting the natural yellowing of aged fabric. Too much bluing left clothes with a bluish tinge, too little accomplished nothing. Getting the proportion right was another domestic skill passed from mother to daughter, learned through practice and failure. Finally, hanging. You carried baskets of wet, wrung laundry out to clotheslines strung between posts or trees, draping and pinning each item to dry in the sun and wind. On good days, warm, breezy, sunny, clothes dried in a few hours and could be brought in by evening. On bad days, cold, humid, still drying, took overnight or longer, and you worried about rain ruining all your work. Winter laundry was particularly challenging. Clothes might freeze solid on the line, requiring you to bring them in stiff as boards and finish drying them indoors near the fire, where they draped over the chairs and hung from hooks, steaming gently into the warmth. Here's a quirky detail that might raise modern eyebrows. Chamber lye. In an era before chemical cleaning products, people experimented with whatever worked, and it turned out that aged urine, left to sit until the ammonia concentration increased, was remarkably effective at removing stains and whitening fabric. Some households kept a chamber pot specifically for collecting urine to use on laundry day. This practice was declining by the 1850s as purchased soap became more available, but it lingered in rural areas and among the poor. Historians still debate how widespread chamber lye use actually was, with some suggesting it was a common if unspoken practice and others arguing it was already considered old-fashioned and slightly shameful by mid-century. Ironing came after the clothes dried, usually the day after washing. Irons were solid chunks of metal heated on the stove, heavy enough to provide the pressure needed to smooth wrinkles, but also heavy enough to exhaust your arm muscles after minutes of use. You kept multiple irons heating at once, rotating them so you always had a hot one ready while the cooling one reheated. The heat was never consistent, sometimes too cool to be effective, sometimes so hot it scorched fabric. And you had to be careful not to touch the iron to your skin, because burns from ironing accidents were common and painful. The women who performed this labour week after week developed observable physical characteristics. Their hands were perpetually rough and often scarred. Their shoulders and backs ached from the repetitive lifting and bending. Some developed chronic respiratory issues from the steam and heat. And yet laundry was considered so fundamental a female skill that failing at it, producing shirts that were stained, dull, wrinkled or worn, reflected poorly on a woman's entire character. A clean, well-maintained household was a moral achievement as much as a practical one. You collapse into bed on wash day night with arms like noodles and hands that throb with each heartbeat. Tomorrow there will be more ironing to finish, clothes to fold and put away, and by next Monday, the whole brutal cycle begins again. Small wonder that the mechanical washing machine, when it eventually became available, was greeted as one of the greatest domestic liberations in human history. The children have been underfoot all morning, the younger ones at least, those too small for fieldwork or school attendance, and watching them navigate this hard-scrabble world provides a window into childhood radically different from the modern experience. In the 1850s, childhood as a protected, playful phase of development barely exists as a concept. Children are small workers, apprentice adults, expected to contribute to household survival almost from the moment they can walk. Consider the tasks assigned to children as young as 4 or 5. They scatter feed for chickens, a job requiring early rising and venturing into the yard alone. They collect kindling, wandering the edges of woodlots to gather fallen twigs and small branches that will keep the cookstove fed. They watch younger siblings while adults attend to work too dangerous or complex for small helpers. A supervision arrangement that might make modern parents gasp. A 6-year-old responsible for a toddler, with adult attention stretched thin across 100 other demands. By age 7 or 8, children's workloads increase substantially. Boys might help with livestock feeding, accompany fathers to fields for light tasks like carrying water or gathering rocks, and begin learning the skills of farming, carpentry, or whatever trade. Their family practices. Girls help with cooking, cleaning, mending, and the endless domestic labour that keeps a household functioning. Their small fingers particularly useful for delicate sewing tasks. Both boys and girls might be hired out to neighbours during busy seasons, planting, harvest, earning small wages that contributed to family income. The mortality that shadows this childhood experience is staggering to modern sensibilities. Roughly 1 in 5 American children died before their 5th birthday in the 1850s. Victims of diseases that today are either eradicated or easily treatable. Measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough, diphtheria, typhoid, cholera, tuberculosis. The list of childhood killers stretches long and grim. Families expected to lose children. They had large families partly in compensation, knowing that some of their sons and daughters would not survive to adulthood. Gravestones in old cemeteries tell the story: multiple children from the same family die within days or weeks of each other during epidemic outbreaks, their short lives commemorated with weeping willows and sleeping lambs carved in stone. The emotional response to this mortality is difficult to assess from our historical distance. Some scholars argue that parents, anticipating loss, maintained a certain emotional distance from young children, protecting themselves from grief by not becoming too attached too soon. Others counter that surviving diaries, letters, and memoirs overflow with parental grief indistinguishable from modern bereavement, that parents loved their children desperately, mourned them extravagantly, and were devastated by losses even when those losses were statistically expected. Historians still argue about how emotional attachment functioned in high-mortality societies, with evidence supporting both the detachment theory and the deep grief theory, suggesting perhaps that different families and individuals responded differently depending on temperament, religious belief, and circumstance. When children fell ill, treatment options were limited and often counterproductive by modern standards. Doctors might prescribe calomel, a mercury compound, as a cure-all, which could cause mercury poisoning on top of whatever disease the child was fighting. They might bleed sick children, weakening already struggling bodies. Patent medicines marketed for children often contained alcohol, opium, or other substances that sedated symptoms while doing nothing to address underlying causes. Well-meaning parents dosed their feverish children with concoctions that we now recognize as dangerous, acting on the best available advice of their era. But children who survived this gauntlet of disease, labour, and limited medical care often emerged remarkably resilient. They knew how to work, how to contribute, how to make themselves useful in dozens of practical ways. A 12-year-old farm boy in the 1850s could plough a field, manage a team of oxen, slaughter a pig, shoot and clean game, and repair basic tools and structures. A 12-year-old farm girl could cook meals for a dozen workers, preserve food for winter, sew and mend clothing, deliver babies into emergencies, acting as assistant to midwives, and manage household finances when her mother was incapacitated. These weren't exceptional children. They were ordinary, prepared by their upbringing for an adult world where such skills were essential. And yet there was play. Historians sometimes overemphasize the labour aspects of historical childhood, creating an impression of joyless drudgery that doesn't match surviving accounts. Children played with homemade toys, dolls stuffed with rags, balls made of wound string, hoops to roll with sticks, stilts, seesaws, swings hung from tree branches. They played games, tag, hide-and-seek, marbles, jackstraws, variations on ball games that would eventually evolve into baseball. They told stories, invented imaginary worlds, had best friends and bitter enemies, and all the social drama that accompanies childhood in any era. The play was often squeezed into margins, after chores, before bed, on Sundays when work was prohibited, but it existed. Parents might be stern about labour expectations, but still take joy in watching their children laugh. The juxtaposition of heavy responsibility and occasional lightness, of mortality's shadow and childhood's natural resilience, creates a texture to 1850s childhood that resists simple characterization. Here's a quirky detail that illuminates both the hardship and the ingenuity of the era. Children's teeth. Baby teeth fell out and adult teeth emerged on the same schedule as today, but dental care was essentially non-existent for most children. Toothbrushes existed but weren't universally used. Many children cleaned their teeth with cloths, chew sticks, or nothing at all. The sugar that increasingly pervaded the American diet accelerated decay, and by adolescence many children had already lost permanent teeth to cavities that today would be filled in a single dental visit. Extractions were performed without anesthesia. A dentist, or more likely a local barber or blacksmith, who pulled teeth as a sideline, yanking the offending tooth with forceps while someone held the screaming child still. The experience was traumatic enough that many people avoided dental care entirely until pain became unbearable, ensuring the problem worsened to the point where extraction was the only remaining option. You watch the children running through the farmyard now, their laughter rising in the morning air, their bare feet splashing through puddles despite the chill, their faces bright with the energy that childhood seems to manufacture from nothing. They don't know that their world is hard by future standards. They know only this life, only this place, only these people who love them and work alongside them and bury those among them who don't make it. They carry smaller buckets, swing smaller scythes, wear smaller versions of adult clothing, and take smaller bites of the hardtack existence their parents chew through every day. Tonight, after supper, one of them will climb into your lap and ask for a story, and you'll tell one, because stories are free and children are precious, and even in the 1850s, that much hasn't changed. The one-room schoolhouse sits at the edge of the settlement, a simple wooden structure not much larger than a generous modern living room. If you're a child of school age, and if your family can spare your labour, and if school is even in session, which it often isn't during planting and harvest seasons, you walk here most mornings, sometimes alone, sometimes with siblings or neighbours' children, on paths that might stretch a mile or more through woods, fields, and whatever weather the season provides. The building itself is rough, unpainted clapboard walls, a shake roof that leaks in heavy rain, windows that let in more draught than light. During winter, a single door faces the road, and inside the furnishings are the Spartan. Rows of rough wooden benches without backs, a few desks for older students, the teacher's desk at the front near a blackboard that's actually just a section of wall painted with dark paint. A pot-bellied stove squats in the centre of the room, its pipe running up through the roof, and this stove is both essential and insufficient. Students near it roast while those at the edges of the room shiver. 60 students might cram into this space, ranging in age from 5 to 18, all taught simultaneously by a single teacher who somehow manages the chaos through a combination of discipline, routine, and occasional corporal punishment. The hickory switch leaning in the corner is not decorative. It's a teaching tool applied to hands, backs, and posteriors when students talk out of turn, fail to recite properly, or commit various other offences against classroom order. Physical punishment of children was not just accepted but expected, and a teacher who couldn't maintain discipline was considered a failure regardless of their educational abilities. The curriculum centred on reading, writing, and arithmetic, the famous 3 R's, with heavy emphasis on memorisation and recitation. You learned by rote, repeating lessons until they etched themselves into memory, chanting multiplication tables and spelling lists and passages of poetry in unison with your classmates. The McGuffey readers, first published in 1836 and continually updated, were the textbooks that shaped multiple generations of American literacy, progressing from simple words and sentences to complex moral tales that taught reading, and ethical lessons simultaneously. Spelling bees were both educational exercises and entertainment, competitions where students from different schools might face off before community audiences. Being a good speller carried social prestige in a way difficult to imagine today. It demonstrated education, attention, and a mastery of written language. Math skills were practical, focused on the calculations needed for farming, commerce, and household management, rather than theoretical. Algebra and geometry might be available at higher academies for students who could afford further education, but the one-room schoolhouse concentrated on addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and enough fractions and percentages to keep accounts straight. Writing was taught through penmanship drills, endless practice forming letters according to prescribed standards. Good penmanship mattered enormously when all communication was handwritten, and your letters, documents, and business records would be judged by their appearance as well as their content. The steel-nibbed pen was replacing the older quill pens during this era, but both required dipping in ink at frequent intervals, and ink stains on fingers, clothes, and desks were constant hazards. Left-handed students were often forced to write with their right hands, the left hand literally tied behind the back in extreme cases, because left-handedness was considered at best inconvenient and at worst somehow sinister. Here's a historical fact that illuminates the era's educational reality. The teachers themselves often had minimal formal education. A teacher might be a young woman with perhaps a few more years of schooling than her oldest students, or a young man working his way toward a different career who taught for a term or two to earn money. Formal teacher training institutions, normal schools, were just beginning to emerge in the 1850s, and standards varied wildly. A teacher was expected to maintain order, hear recitations, and somehow advance students through material, but pedagogical theory as we understand it barely existed. School terms were short, often 3 or 4 months in winter when farm labour was least needed, with a possible summer session of similar length for younger children whose labour wasn't essential to harvest. Attendance was irregular. Children stayed home to help with emergencies, illnesses, births, and seasonal demands, and moving through grade levels depended less on age than on demonstrated mastery of material. A bright 8-year-old might share a reader with a slow 12-year-old, and neither would find this remarkable. Girls and boys learned together in the same room, though their ultimate educational expectations differed. Boys were being prepared for lives as farmers, tradesmen, or professionals. Girls were being prepared for lives as wives and mothers. Both needed basic literacy and numeracy, but only boys typically continued to higher education if family resources permitted. A girl who excelled academically might become a teacher herself for a few years before marriage, one of the few respectable occupations open to educated women. The social dynamics of the one-room schoolhouse were complex and fierce. Children from different families, sometimes from families with long-standing disputes, sat side by side. Bullying occurred, friendships formed, romances kindled among older students. The teacher had to manage not just education, but all the interpersonal drama that develops when 5-year-olds share space with teenagers, when farm workers' children sit beside merchants' children, when 50 or 60 young humans are compressed into a room for hours at a time. A quirky detail. Lunch. Students brought their own food in pails or wrapped in cloths, cold biscuits, leftover cornbread, maybe a piece of pie or a boiled egg, and ate it at midday, either inside if weather was bad or outside if it was tolerable. There was no cafeteria, no hot lunch program, and what you ate advertised your family's means as clearly as your clothes did. Wealthy children might have ham sandwiches and fresh fruit. Poor children made do with corn pone and molasses. Teachers sometimes noted which students went hungry and occasionally supplemented meals from their own supplies, acts of kindness that exceeded their job descriptions. The school day lasted from 8 or 9 in the morning until 4 or 5 in the afternoon, a schedule that modern children might find familiar, though the content of those hours was vastly different. No art class, no music appreciation, no physical education beyond walking to and from school and the rough games played at recess. No science laboratory, no library beyond the books the teacher brought, no computers or even typewriters or even pencils in some cases. The slate and slate pencil, erasable and reusable, served where paper was too expensive. You walk home in the afternoon light, your mind full of half-learned lessons and the gossip of classmates, your feet tracing the same path they'll trace hundreds more times before you leave school for good. The education you're receiving is limited by any modern standard, but it's not nothing. You can read, a skill that opens worlds, and write well enough to compose a letter. You can calculate what you're owed and what you owe. And you've spent time with people beyond your immediate family, absorbing social skills and community knowledge that serve purposes beyond any curriculum. Tomorrow, weather permitting and family circumstances allowing, you'll walk this path again. Imagine this: you've developed a toothache. It started as a vague sensitivity, a twinge when you drank cold water from the well, but over days it's escalated into a throbbing agony that keeps you awake at night and makes eating unbearable. You need medical help, but what exactly does that mean in the 1850s? Your options are frankly grim. If you're lucky, your community has a physician, someone who has actually studied medicine, possibly at one of the medical colleges that were proliferating across America, graduating doctors after courses as short as a few months. If you're less lucky, you're served by a self-taught practitioner who learned through apprenticeship and experience, someone who might be genuinely skilled, but whose understanding of human health is based on theories we now know to be largely incorrect. The dominant medical framework of the era was still humoral theory, the ancient Greek idea that the body contained four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose balance determined health. Disease resulted from imbalance, and treatment aimed at restoring equilibrium through methods that seem barbaric today: bloodletting, purging, blistering, and sweating. A patient with a fever might have blood drained in the belief that excess blood was causing the inflammation. A patient with digestive complaints might be given powerful laxatives to purge whatever was causing the imbalance. The treatments were often worse than the diseases, weakening already orthodontic sick patients and occasionally killing them outright. For your toothache specifically, the treatment is extraction. There is no filling the cavity, no root canal, no saving the tooth. Once decay has progressed to the point of significant pain, the tooth comes out. If you're willing to endure the extraction, which many people delayed until the pain became absolutely unbearable, allowing infections to spread and health to deteriorate further. The person performing this extraction might be a dentist. Dental specialization was emerging during this era, or might be a barber, a blacksmith, a general physician, or essentially anyone who owned extraction forceps and advertised their services. You sit in a chair, possibly with someone holding your head still, and someone else holding your arms, and the tooth is gripped with metal forceps and yanked. There is no anesthesia for most dental procedures during most of the 1850s, though the decade did see the introduction of ether and chloroform as surgical anesthetics, a revolutionary development that transformed medicine. Whether these new anesthetics are available in your community depends on how quickly innovations spread from cities to rural areas, which was often slow. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Ether was first publicly demonstrated as a surgical anesthetic in Boston in 1846, and by the early 1850s, its use was spreading, though unevenly. The first tooth extracted under anesthesia at Massachusetts General Hospital was a landmark moment in medical history, the beginning of the end of surgical procedures as torture to be endured while conscious. But in small towns and rural areas, the news might not have arrived, the equipment might not be available, or the local practitioner might not trust the newfangled innovation. Your extraction experience depended heavily on geography and luck. Patent medicines filled the gaps left by official medical care, and the 1850s market was flooded with them. These were proprietary concoctions sold in bottles and tins, advertised with extravagant claims in newspaper columns and travelling medicine shows. They claimed to cure everything from headaches to cancer, from female complaints to male weakness, from childhood fevers to old age decline. What they actually contained was often harmful. Alcohol in quantities that would be illegal today without a license, opium and its derivatives providing pain relief through addiction, mercury compounds like calomel that cause cumulative poisoning, and various herbal ingredients ranging from ineffective to actively dangerous. Laudanum, tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, was particularly widespread and particularly devastating. It was sold without prescription, given to fussy babies to quiet them, taken by adults, for every kind of pain and distress, and highly addictive. Users developed tolerance, requiring ever larger doses, and dependence that made stopping agonizing. The opium habit was recognized as a problem by the end of the century, but during the 1850s, laudanum was as commonly found in medicine cabinets as aspirin is today. Women faced particular medical challenges compounded by Social restrictions. Pregnancy and childbirth were managed by the midwives in most cases, with physicians called only when complications arose, and by that point, the complications might be beyond anyone's ability to address. Maternal mortality was shockingly high. Roughly 1 in 100 births resulted in the mother's death, meaning that a woman who bore 6 children faced a roughly 6% lifetime risk of dying in childbirth. Interventions like caesarean sections existed but were usually fatal. They were attempted only when the baby was already dead and the goal was saving the mother's life, often unsuccessfully. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the experimental nature of medical thinking. In some communities, doctors experimented with electricity as a cure. Galvanic devices that applied mild electrical current were marketed as health aids, supposedly rebalancing the body's mysterious internal forces. These devices did nothing useful, but they didn't cause obvious harm, either making them relatively benign by the standards of an era when many treatments actively killed patients. Mental health care was even more primitive and often cruel. People suffering from what we now recognize as depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and other conditions were labeled insane, and, if their symptoms were severe enough to disrupt daily life, might be committed to asylums where treatments included restraints, isolation, ice baths, and various interventions designed to shock the patient back to sanity. The concept of mental illness as a medical condition deserving compassionate treatment was emerging. Reformer Dorothea Dix was campaigning throughout the 1850s for better asylum conditions, but the default remained fear, stigma, and often abuse. Historians still argue about whether 1850s Americans were actually sicker than modern Americans, or whether they simply lacked the diagnostic tools to identify and name their ailments. Certainly, infectious diseases killed people who today would survive with antibiotics. Accidents in farms and factories caused disabilities that today would be surgically repaired. Conditions like diabetes, hypertension, and cancer existed but weren't always recognized. People died of consumption or fever or decline without understanding the underlying pathology. And yet people survived, raised families, lived to old age. The human body is remarkably resilient, and 1850s Americans who made it past the dangerous years of childhood often proved remarkably tough. They walked off injuries that would hospitalize modern patients, recovered from fevers without pharmaceutical intervention, and endured chronic conditions that today would prompt immediate medical attention. Was this hardiness or simply the absence of alternatives? Perhaps both. Your toothache eventually subsides, either because you finally had the tooth pulled and the wound healed, or because the nerve died and the pain stopped, though the infection remains, ticking time bomb beneath your gum. Either way, you're back on your feet, back to work, back to a life where medical care is something you avoid until avoidance is no longer possible. You learn to live with a lot of discomfort. That's simply what being human in the 1850s requires. The general store stands at the centre of town like a secular temple to commerce and community. You push open the door, a bell tinkling to announce your arrival, and step into a space that assaults your senses with its cluttered abundance. Barrels of crackers and pickles and nails crowd the floor. Bolts of fabric in every colour stack on shelves reaching to the ceiling. Behind the counter, jars of candy gleam in the light from the windows, and somewhere nearby hangs a wheel of cheese, a side of bacon, strings of dried apples, and quite possibly a few animal pelts waiting to be shipped back east. The general store is the Amazon.com of the 1850s, the place where you can find almost anything you might need, from practical necessities to imported luxuries. The storekeeper serves as purchaser, inventory manager, and curator, selecting goods from wholesalers in distant cities and marking them up for local retail. The selection reflects both community needs and the storekeeper's judgment about what will sell. Farming tools, sewing notions, patent medicines, books, writing supplies, dishes, pots and pans, spices, coffee and tea, tobacco, firearms and ammunition, shoes, hats, suspenders, and dozens of other categories of goods. Prices are rarely marked. The storekeeper quotes figures from memory or from handwritten notes, and those figures might vary depending on who's buying, how they're paying, and what relationship exists between buyer and seller. This is an economy of negotiation rather than fixed pricing, and a savvy shopper knows to haggle, to express skepticism about quality, to mention that the store in the next town over charges less. The storekeeper, for his part, defends his prices, emphasizes the quality of his goods, and makes deals when necessary to move merchandise or cement customer loyalty. Credit is the lifeblood of this system, Most rural customers don't pay cash for their purchases. They run a tab, tracked in ledger books that the storekeeper guards like sacred texts. Farmers buy supplies on credit in spring when they're planting, promising to pay after harvest when their crops sell. If the harvest is good, they settle their debts and start the cycle again. If the harvest fails, to weather pests, disease or market collapse, debts accumulate, interest compounds, and financial ruin beckons. The general store ledger contains the economic history of the community, each entry a story of purchase and promise, payment and default. This credit relationship gives the storekeeper considerable power. He decides who gets credit and how much, essentially determining which families can acquire the goods they need to survive and which cannot. Oh, storekeeper who likes you might extend generous terms through a bad year. One who doesn't might cut you off exactly when you need help most. The relationship is personal in ways that modern commerce has largely lost. You know your storekeeper, he knows you, and the transaction involves not just money, but reputation, trust, and community standing. Here's a quirky detail about currency that might surprise you. There was no standard national currency in the 1850s. Hundreds of different banks issued their own paper notes, each theoretically redeemable for specie gold or silver coin, at the issuing bank. But the value of these notes varied wildly depending on the issuing bank's reputation, the distance from that bank, and whether the bank was even still solvent. A $10 note from a solid Boston bank might be accepted at face value. A $10 note from a frontier bank in Wisconsin might be discounted to $8 or refused entirely. Counterfeit notes circulated freely, and determining whether a particular bill was genuine required specialized knowledge and reference guides called banknote reporters. Storekeepers became amateur currency experts by necessity. They learned to examine notes for signs of counterfeiting, to assess the reputation of distant banks, to negotiate the value of unfamiliar currency. If you presented a note they didn't recognize, they might accept it at a steep discount or refuse it entirely, leaving you to find other means of payment. Gold and silver coins were universally accepted, that was the point of specie, but most transactions involved paper, with all its attendant complications. Barter persisted alongside money transactions. You might bring eggs, butter, vegetables from your garden, or other goods and trade them directly for store merchandise. The storekeeper maintained these goods until someone else wanted them, essentially running a barter exchange alongside his retail operation. Skilled labour could also be traded. Ace. Carpenter might build shelves in exchange for goods. A seamstress might sew shirts for store credit. The economy was remarkably flexible, accommodating various forms of value exchange that kept commerce flowing even when cash was scarce. The social function of the general store was as important as its economic function. This was where you heard news: who was born, who died, who was getting married, who was feuding with whom. Newspapers from distant cities arrived here, and customers gathered to read them aloud or discuss their contents. Local notices posted on the wall announced auctions, land sales, meetings, and events. Men gathered around the stove in winter, spitting tobacco juice into brass spittoons and arguing about politics, weather, and each other. The storekeeper heard everything and repeated much of it, a central node in the community's information network. Women visited the general store less frequently than men. Shopping was often considered a male responsibility, and the male-dominated loitering space wasn't always comfortable for women, but when they did, they might spend considerable time examining fabrics, comparing qualities, and discussing options with the storekeeper. Choosing material for a dress was a significant decision. That dress might be worn for years, and the fabric needed to be both attractive and durable. The storekeeper kept up with fashion trends, stocking goods that met local standards of propriety, while occasionally introducing new patterns or colours from the urban style centres. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Chain stores didn't exist in the 1850s. The general store was an independent operation, owned by a local merchant who lived above or behind the store, who knew his customers by name and whose success or failure depended entirely on his own judgment and effort. The impersonality of modern retail, buying from corporations headquartered thousands of miles away, staffed by minimum wage workers who don't know you, from any other customer, was unimaginable. Commerce was personal, and that personality cut both ways. It provided warmth and flexibility, but also enabled discrimination, favoritism, and petty tyranny. You make your purchases, a few pounds of coffee, a paper of pins, a new comb since your old one cracked, and the storekeeper notes them in his ledger under your family's name. You'll settle up after harvest, God willing and the weather permitting. You exchange a few words about the season's prospects, hear that old Mrs. Henderson's been feeling poorly, and learn that a new family has bought the farm out on the West Road. Then you tuck your goods into your basket and head back into the daylight, your place in the community reinforced by this small ritual of commerce and conversation. The currency confusion you just witnessed at the general store deserves deeper exploration, because the monetary chaos of 1850s America has shaped daily life in ways both frustrating and fascinating. Imagine a modern world where every state had its own currency, every major bank issued its own bills, and figuring out whether you were about to be ripped off required consulting reference guides and making judgment calls. That was financial reality before the Civil War. The United States Constitution gave the federal government exclusive power to coin money, but this was interpreted narrowly to mean metal coins only. Paper currency issued by the federal government was minimal, and most paper money circulating in the economy came from state-chartered banks. These banks issued banknotes, promises to pay the bearer a certain amount in gold or silver coin that functioned as money for everyday transactions. In theory, you could take a banknote to the issuing bank and redeem it for specie. In practice, the issuing bank might be hundreds of miles away, might have failed since issuing the note, or might simply refuse redemption through various pretexts. The number of different banknotes in circulation was staggering. Historians estimate that thousands of different notes from hundreds of different banks circulated simultaneously, each with its own design, denomination, and degree of reliability. Some banks were rock-solid institutions that always redeemed their notes at face value. These notes circulated freely and were accepted everywhere. Other banks were fly-by-night operations that issued notes with no intention of ever redeeming them, essentially printing money until they disappeared. Most banks fell somewhere between these extremes, their notes accepted at varying discounts depending on reputation and circumstance. Counterfeiters thrived in this environment. With thousands of different legitimate note designs circulating, spotting a fake was genuinely difficult even for experts. Counterfeiters could invent entirely fictional banks, print convincing-looking notes, and pass them off on unsuspecting merchants who had no way to verify whether the Bank of Somewhere, Indiana actually existed. Some estimates suggest that between 1/3 and 1/2 of all currency in circulation during the 1850s was counterfeit. Let that sink in. There was a decent chance that any given bill you received was fake. To navigate this chaos, businesses and individuals relied on counterfeit detectors and banknote reporters, periodicals that listed every known bank, the current value of its notes, descriptions for identifying genuine bills, and warnings about circulating counterfeits. These publications were essential business tools, consulted regularly by anyone handling significant amounts of money. They were also imperfect, inevitably lagging behind the ever-changing landscape of bank failures, new counterfeits, and fluctuating values. Here's a quirky detail that illustrates the creativity of the era. Some communities developed their own local currencies or credit systems to reduce reliance on unreliable banknotes. Labour exchanges, store credit networks, and commodity-backed local currencies emerged as alternatives. If you couldn't trust the paper money, you could trust your neighbours, or at least you could trust them more than you trusted distant banks. Barter remained essential partly because of this currency dysfunction. Trading eggs for flour, labour for goods, livestock for land, these transactions bypassed the monetary system entirely, avoiding the uncertainties of paper money. The 1850s economy was remarkably hybrid, with cash, credit, barter, and various workarounds coexisting in complex combinations tailored to local circumstances. The federal government was aware of the problem, but constrained by political and constitutional limitations. Paper money issued by the government itself wouldn't become widespread until the Civil War, when the Union needed to finance military operations and began printing greenbacks, the precursors to modern Federal Reserve notes. Until then, the monetary system remained a decentralized mess that somehow functioned through collective improvisation and mutual trust. Gold and silver coins served as the bedrock of value, the stable reference point against which paper fluctuated. If someone demanded specie payment, they wanted actual metal, and that metal held its value regardless of which bank's notes were currently trading at discount. But coins were heavy, awkward for large transactions, and often in short supply, much of America's gold and silver was shipped abroad to pay for imported goods, leaving domestic commerce chronically short of reliable currency. Prices in this environment were never as fixed as they appear in modern economies. The same goods might sell for different amounts depending on how you paid: cash in reliable notes, cash in questionable notes, credit or barter goods. Merchants built currency risk into their pricing, charging more for goods sold on credit or paid in unfamiliar banknotes. Negotiations about payment terms were negotiations about real value, not just about timing. The psychological impact of this monetary chaos is difficult to quantify, but surely significant. Modern Americans take monetary stability largely for granted. A dollar is a dollar, accepted everywhere. Its value predictable enough that we plan years into the future assuming dollars will continue to work. 1850s. Americans lived with constant monetary uncertainty. Would this note be accepted? At what discount? Was it even real? Every transaction required vigilance, every payment received required assessment, and the financial ground beneath your feet was never entirely solid. Historians still argue about whether this monetary system hindered or enabled economic growth. Some suggest the decentralization provided flexibility, allowing credit to expand and contract locally in response to actual economic conditions. Others emphasize the inefficiencies, the counterfeiting losses, and the barriers to interstate commerce created by currency fragmentation. What's clear is that people adapted, developing the skills and institutions necessary to function in a monetary environment that would seem chaotic to modern eyes. Your visit to the general store, then, was not just a shopping trip, but a navigation of financial complexity. The prices you paid reflected not just the cost of goods, but the value of your payment, the reliability of your credit, and the storekeeper's assessment of monetary risk. Commerce in the 1850s required financial literacy of a particular kind, not the spreadsheet and investment skills of modern finance, but the street smarts needed to detect counterfeits, assess banks, and negotiate value in a world without reliable money. As you walk home with your purchases, you feel the coins and notes in your pocket, each one a small bet on the stability of institutions you cannot see. That's always been true of money, of course. The difference is that in the 1850s, the bet was obvious, the risk was tangible, and everyone knew the game. They were playing. The sun has climbed toward noon, and your stomach reminds you that breakfast was hours ago. In the 1850s, the midday meal, called dinner confusingly since supper comes in the evening, is the largest and most important meal of the day. This isn't arbitrary. It reflects the practical reality of an agricultural society where people work outdoors from dawn and need substantial fuel to power afternoon labour. Dinner preparation has been underway since morning, the cook stove working continuously to produce a meal that will feed the family and any hired workers. The centrepiece is typically some form of meat: salt pork or bacon from the cellar stores, fresh pork if a pig was recently slaughtered, beef if cattle were available, chicken on special occasions, wild game if someone went hunting. The meat is usually stewed, boiled or roasted. Frying is more common for breakfast, while midday meals favour longer cooking methods that develop flavour while the cook attends to other tasks. Surrounding the meat are vegetables dependent entirely on season. In summer and early autumn, gardens overflow with tomatoes, beans, squash, corn, cucumbers, onions and herbs. These appear fresh on the table, simply prepared, their abundance almost overwhelming for a few glorious weeks. In winter and spring, vegetables come from preservation. Pickled cucumbers, sauerkraut, dried beans soaked and simmered, root vegetables like carrots and turnips stored in the cellar, canned goods if the family has mastered that relatively new preservation technology. The canning process, sealing food in glass jars using heat to kill bacteria, was developed in the early 19th century, but remained somewhat risky as improper technique could allow deadly botulism to develop in seemingly sealed containers. Bread accompanies almost every meal, whether wheat bread, cornbread, biscuits, or some regional variation. Carbohydrates fill the stomach and extend the protein. Butter, if you have a cow and have found time to churn, softens the bread, and molasses provides sweetness when sugar is scarce. Potatoes increasingly appear on American tables as the decade progresses, though the Irish famine's association with potato dependency makes some Americans suspicious of relying too heavily on any single crop. The family gathers around the table as they did at breakfast, but the mood is different now. Morning was hurried, everyone eager to get to their tasks. Dinner is a pause in the day's rhythm, a moment to refuel not just bodies but also spirits. Conversation flows more easily when hunger is being satisfied. Father reports on the morning's progress in the fields. Mother describes household accomplishments and concerns. Children share schoolyard dramas or report on their chores. Here's a mainstream historical fact about 1850s eating habits. Americans in this era consumed vastly more meat than their European counterparts, particularly compared to the peasant classes of the Old World. Meat was abundant and relatively cheap in a land where livestock could graze on seemingly endless pastures. European visitors frequently remarked on how much meat Americans ate, multiple times daily, in quantities that seemed extravagant to people accustomed to regarding meat as a Sunday luxury. This protein abundance contributed to the relative height and health of native-born Americans, though it would begin to diminish later in the century as urbanization and industrialization changed food systems. The meal takes time, perhaps an hour, compared to the rushed breakfast and the usually light supper. Workers need to rest as well as eat, and the midday break allows for recovery before the afternoon's labour. Digestion is not something to be hurried. The heavy food sits in your stomach, making you drowsy, encouraging a brief rest before work resumes. In the hottest parts of summer, this midday break might extend longer, as working during peak heat risks heat exhaustion, while cooler mornings and evenings are more productive. Clean-up after dinner falls to women and older girls, of course. Dishes need scraping, washing in heated water, drying and putting away. Scraps go to pigs or chickens, nothing edible is wasted. The cook stove needs tending, perhaps fresh wood added to maintain the heat for afternoon baking, or food preservation tasks. The kitchen, which steamed with cooking activity all morning, gradually returns to a more resting state, though it's never truly dormant. The fire must be maintained, the next meal already beginning to take shape in planning, if not actual preparation. Here's a quirky detail about 1850s mealtime etiquette. There were strict rules about who served themselves first and how food was passed. The father, as head of household, was served first or served himself first, and others proceeded in order of status. Mother next, then children by age. Reaching across the table or beginning to eat before everyone was served was considered rude. These customs reinforced social hierarchy even within families and trained children in the deference expected in the broader society. The beverages accompanying dinner were typically water, milk, or something fermented. Coffee and tea were reserved more for morning and evening. Midday drinks were simpler. Cider, alcoholic as there was no reliable way to preserve apple juice without fermentation, was common in apple-growing regions. Beer appeared on some tables, especially in communities with German immigrants who brought brewing traditions. The temperance movement was gaining strength during the 1850s, and some families abstained from all alcohol. But total abstinence was still a minority position. Most Americans drank casually, considering beer and cider part of ordinary refreshment rather than dangerous intoxication. You push back from the table, stomach pleasantly full, body heavy with the satisfaction of a good meal. The afternoon stretches ahead, full of labour. That seems more bearable now that you've rested and refueled. The rhythm of work and rest, exertion and recovery, structures the day in ways that the modern continuous work cultures have largely abandoned. There's wisdom in this rhythm, a recognition that human beings are not machines capable of constant output, but organisms requiring regular inputs of food, rest and renewal. The dishes clatter in the background as you head back outside, where the fields wait and the animals wait, and the endless list of tasks continues its patient demand. But for now, in this moment between dinner and afternoon labour, there's a small peace, the simple contentment of a full stomach and a moment to breathe. The afternoon sun hangs heavy over the fields as you return to work, and now we should explore in depth what that work actually involves. Agriculture in the 1850s is transforming, caught between the ancient methods that humans had practiced for millennia and the mechanical innovations that would eventually revolutionize farming, but that revolution remains incomplete, leaving you straddling two worlds. If you're working a small family farm, your primary tool is still the plough, and your primary power source is still muscle, your own and your animals. The plough itself has improved significantly in recent decades. The steel plough invented by John Deere in 1837 cuts through tough prairie soils far more efficiently than older iron and wooden designs, and it's spreading across American farmland during the 1850s. but even a good plough requires someone to walk behind it, guiding the blade, while horses or oxen pull from the front. Mile after mile of furrow, day after day of trudging through turned earth, your boots heavy with mud, your arms aching from the constant adjustments of the plough's angle and depth. Here's a historical fact that puts the labour in perspective. Ploughing an acre of land using animal power took roughly 5 to 8 hours of work. A farm of 40 acres, small by the standards of the era, might require weeks of continuous ploughing just to prepare the soil for planting. And ploughing was just the beginning. After the soil was turned, it needed to be harrowed to break up clumps, planted with seed, cultivated during the growing season to remove weeds, and finally harvested, each step requiring its own exhausting labour. Harvesting grain without modern machinery was particularly brutal. If you're harvesting wheat, you're using a scythe or cradle, a scythe fitted with wooden fingers that catch the cut stalks and lay them in neat rows. You swing this tool in a continuous rhythm, hour after hour, cutting swathes through the golden wheat while the sun beats down and the chaff fills your nose and mouth and sticks to your sweaty skin. Behind you, other workers gather the cut wheat into the bundles called sheaves, tying them with the twisted wheat stalks and stacking them into shocks to dry. Later, the dried wheat must be threshed, the grain separated from the stalks, either by beating it with flails or by having horses trample it on a threshing floor. Mechanical reapers were invented in the 1830s by Cyrus McCormick and others, and during the 1850s these machines were beginning to spread across American farms. A reaper could harvest as much wheat in a day as several men with scythes, a productivity increase that was transforming agriculture in regions that adopted the new technology. But reapers were expensive, hundreds of dollars, equivalent to many months of a labourer's wages, and not every farmer could afford one or needed one for the scale of their operation. The 1850s farming landscape was a patchwork of old and new, with mechanical and manual methods existing side by side, sometimes on the same farm. Here's a quirky detail that illuminates the human reality behind agricultural statistics. Wheat harvesting had to happen within a narrow window of time. If you cut too early, the grain wasn't fully developed. Too late, and it would shatter and fall from the stalks lost on the ground. This window might be only a week or two, creating frantic periods of labour when everyone in the family worked from dawn to dark and neighbours pooled their efforts in communal harvesting bees. Sleep deprivation during harvest was simply accepted as necessary. The crops you grew depended heavily on region and soil. In the northeast, diversified farming prevailed. Wheat, corn, vegetables, dairy and livestock all combined on family farms that aimed for self-sufficiency with some surplus for sale. In the south, cotton dominated where conditions permitted, but we'll address that devastating monoculture and its enslaved workforce in a later section. In the Midwest, wheat farming was expanding dramatically onto former prairie lands, feeding a growing urban population and an export market reaching Europe. Corn grew everywhere, the versatile grain that fed families, fattened livestock, and could be distilled into whiskey for sale. The uncertainty hanging over every farm was existential. Weather determined success or failure in ways that no human effort could control. A late frost killed seedlings, a summer drought stunted growth. Early autumn rains rotted the harvest before it could be gathered. Hailstorms destroyed standing crops in minutes. Insect infestations, locusts, hessian flies, corn borers could devastate fields with no effective countermeasures beyond hope and prayer. Plant diseases spread unpredictably, sometimes wiping out entire regional crops. Farmers operated always under the shadow of potential ruin, knowing that one bad season could mean the loss of the farm itself, foreclosure on debts, and starting over somewhere else with nothing. The work wasn't only field labour. Maintaining tools, mending fences, building and repairing structures, managing woodlots for fuel and timber, breeding and caring for livestock, the list was endless and varied with the seasons. Winter brought a different kind of work, butchering stored livestock, maintaining equipment, clearing brush, cutting firewood to stockpile for next year. There was no off-season, only seasons with different work. Historians still argue about whether farm families in this era had any leisure time at all, or whether the concept of leisure is a modern intrusion onto a past that organised life around work, rest, and religious observance rather than work versus leisure dichotomies. The answer is probably complicated. There were moments of rest, periods of reduced labour intensity, and certainly days, Sundays, holidays, set aside for non-work activities. But the idea of deliberately choosing leisure over work, of valuing relaxation as an end in itself rather than as recovery for further work, was emerging slowly, not yet the cultural norm. You straighten your aching back and survey the field, rows of whatever crop is growing stretching toward the horizon. This is the backbone of America, not the cities slowly rising in the east, not the frontier slowly pushing west, but these endless farm fields where millions of ordinary people labour to produce the food that feeds the nation. It's not glamorous, it's rarely documented, and it's almost impossible to romanticise once you've experienced the dirt under your fingernails and the ache in every muscle. But it's yours. This work, this land, this life, and there's meaning in that, even when the meaning is hard to feel through the exhaustion. Now let's step away from the farm and into a different world of labour. The factories, mills, and workshops that were transforming the American economy and the American experience. If you live in or near a growing northern city during the 1850s, there's a decent chance your family's livelihood depends not on agriculture but on industry, and that means entering a world of clattering machinery, rigid schedules, and dangers that make farm work look almost gentle by comparison. The textile mill is perhaps the most iconic industrial workplace of the era. These massive brick buildings, often situated beside rivers whose water power turns the machinery, employ hundreds or thousands of workers producing cotton and wool fabric. The workers are predominantly women and girls, the famous mill girls of Lowell and other New England textile towns, recruited from farms and promised steady wages, education opportunities and respectable boarding house accommodations. The reality by the 1850s is often grimmer than the promises. Wages have been cut repeatedly, hours have been extended, and the boarding houses that once seemed liberating now feel like extensions of factory discipline. You enter the mill at first light, perhaps 5 a.m. during summer months, and you don't leave until 7 p.m. or later, 12 to 14 hours of labour, 6 days a week. The noise inside is overwhelming, dozens of power looms clattering simultaneously in a din that makes conversation impossible. Workers develop hand signals, lip-reading skills to communicate. Shouted words simply disappear into the mechanical roar. The air is thick with cotton dust and lint, coating your lungs with every breath, contributing to respiratory diseases that shorten lives. Some mills spray water into the air to keep cotton fibres pliable, adding humidity that makes the heat nearly unbearable in summer. The machinery you tend is dangerous in ways that no modern safety regulation would permit. Unguarded belts and gears can catch loose clothing, hair or fingers, pulling bodies into mechanical destruction. Exhaustion after 12 hours of standing and repetitive motion makes workers careless. Industrial accidents are so common that newspapers barely report them unless deaths reach unusual numbers. Children work alongside adults. Some mills employ children as young as 7 or 8 for tasks requiring small fingers to fit into narrow spaces. And these children face all the same dangers with less judgment and experience too. Protect them. Here's a mainstream historical fact. There were essentially no workplace safety regulations in the 1850s. No federal agency inspected factories. No state laws mandated safety guards on machinery or limited working hours. What rules existed were voluntary, often adopted by the more progressive factory owners who believed healthy workers were more predictive than injured ones. But these were exceptions. Most factory owners operated on the principle of minimizing costs and maximizing output, and worker well-being ranked far below profit in the calculation. Wages in factories were paid in cash, usually weekly, at rates that seem almost impossibly low by modern standards. A skilled male worker might earn $6 to $10 per week. Women and children earned less, sometimes half as much for similar work. From these wages, workers paid for boarding, food, clothing, and any other expenses, often leaving little for savings. Some factories paid partly in scrip company issued, currency redeemable only at company stores, which trapped workers in cycles of debt to their employers. Ironworkers, shipbuilders, carpenters, masons and other skilled tradesmen worked in conditions that were dangerous in different ways. Heavy materials fell, crushing limbs. Molten metal splashed, causing horrific burns. Saws and hammers slipped, severing fingers or worse. The concept of workers' compensation did not exist. If you were injured on the job, you lost your wages, paid for your own medical care, and hoped your family could survive until you recovered. If you recovered. Workers permanently disabled by industrial accidents faced grim futures, dependent on family charity or public poor relief. Here's a quirky detail about factory life that reveals both the era's peculiarities and its continuities. Factory owners often tried to control workers' lives outside the workplace as well. Boarding houses for mill girls had curfews, prohibited alcohol, required church attendance, and enforced behavioural standards. Some employers monitored workers' morality, firing those who were seen behaving improperly. This paternalistic control was presented as benevolent concern for workers' welfare, but it also served employers' interests by maintaining a disciplined, dependent workforce. The workers themselves were not entirely passive. The 1850s saw significant labour organising activity, with workers forming unions to demand better wages, shorter hours and improved conditions. These early unions faced hostile employers, unsympathetic courts, and a society that largely viewed collective bargaining as illegitimate interference with the free market. Strikes occurred, and sometimes succeeded in winning concessions, but just as often they failed, crushed by employer power, replacement workers, and sheer economic desperation that drove strikers back to work under any terms. The factories you might encounter represent America's industrial future, a future that would transform the SAS nation from agricultural to industrial over the coming decades, drawing millions from farms to cities, from self-directed work to clock-punching employment. In the 1850s, this transformation is underway but incomplete. Most Americans still farm, most communities still centre on agriculture, but the smoke rising from factory chimneys in Lowell, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and dozens of other cities signals changes that would reshape everything. You leave the factory at the end of your shift, ears ringing, lungs coughing, fingers aching from 12 hours of repetitive work. The twilight air outside feels impossibly fresh after the mill's thick atmosphere. You have a few hours before curfew, a few hours to eat, perhaps write a letter home, perhaps talk with friends in the boarding house parlour. Tomorrow you'll be back at the machines, and the day after and the day after that, in a rhythm that feels less like the natural cycles of farm life and more like the mechanical ticking of the clock that now governs your existence. This is progress, they tell you. This is the future. You're not sure whether to believe them. The women of 1850s America, whether on farms, in factories, or in the homes of merchants and professionals, share a common experience of work that never ends and recognition that rarely comes. The phrase women's work sounds almost quaint to modern ears, but understanding what it actually entailed reveals a labour burden that would stagger any modern person dropped into its midst. Begin with the assumption that everything takes longer. Every task you might accomplish in minutes with modern appliances takes hours with 19th century methods. Cooking a meal requires managing a wood fire. Cleaning clothes requires the multi-day laundry ordeal we discussed earlier. Keeping a house clean means hauling water, making soap, scrubbing surfaces by hand. Every garment your family wears must be sewn either from fabric you weave yourself, increasingly rare by the 1850s, or from fabric purchased and cut and assembled at home. Every tear must be mended, every button reattached, every worn spot reinforced until the garment finally falls apart beyond repair. Child-rearing adds another layer of ceaseless labour. Babies require constant attention, feeding, cleaning, soothing, and there are no diapers to throw away, only cloth that must be washed again and again. Toddlers require supervision to prevent the countless dangers of farm and home. Fires, wells, livestock, tools, ponds. Older children require education, training, and discipline to prepare them for adult roles. And throughout, illness strikes, requiring nursing care that falls almost entirely on female shoulders, sitting up through feverish nights, administering whatever medicines are available, mourning when the fever proves fatal. Food preservation dominates much of women's summer and autumn labour. The harvest abundance must somehow last through winter and spring, and making it last requires enormous effort. Vegetables are pickled in vinegar and brine, fermented into sauerkraut and similar preparations. Fruits are dried or made into preserves with precious sugar, or converted into cider and vinegar. Meat is salted, smoked or packed in fat. Careful management of the root cellar keeps potatoes, carrots, onions and apples viable for months. A single failure, one jar that didn't seal properly, one barrel that spoiled, might mean hunger before spring arrives. Here's a mainstream historical fact about women's legal status that coloured every aspect of their experience. Under the doctrine of couverture, married women essentially had no legal existence separate from their husbands. They could not own property in their own names, could not sign contracts, could not sue or be sued, could not vote. Their wages, if they earned any, legally belonged to their husbands. Their children legally belonged to their husbands. Even their bodies legally belonged to their husbands, who could not be prosecuted for rape within marriage. Some states were beginning to pass Married Women's Property Acts during the 1850s, granting wives limited property rights, but these reforms were piecemeal and incomplete. For most American women, marriage meant legal invisibility. Single women had more legal rights, they could own property, earn wages, conduct business, but faced severe social limitations. An unmarried woman past her mid-20s was considered a spinster, pitied and often marginalised. The few professions open to respectable single women, teaching, writing, certain kinds of domestic service, paid poorly and offered little security. Most women understood that marriage, whatever its limitations, was the most viable path to economic security and social acceptance. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the domestic intensity of women's work: candle making. Before kerosene lamps became common later in the century, candles provided indoor lighting, and most households made their own. This meant collecting and rendering animal fat, tallow, preparing wicks from cotton string, and repeatedly dipping the wicks into melted fat until candles of usable thickness accumulated. The process was tedious, messy, and produced candles that gave relatively dim light and smelled of their animal origins. Beeswax candles were superior but expensive. Most families reserved them for special occasions. The women's rights movement was gaining momentum during the 1850s, energised by the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, and led by advocates like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. These reformers demanded legal equality, property rights, educational access, and eventually the vote. Their arguments were radical for their time, met with ridicule, hostility, and accusations of undermining family and society. Progress would be painfully slow. American women wouldn't gain the vote until 1920. But the groundwork was being laid in these antebellum decades, as women began articulating their grievances and organising to address them. Historians still argue about how 1850s women understood and experienced their situation. Were they oppressed and resentful, or did they find meaning and satisfaction in domestic labour and family life? The answer is probably yes to both, depending on individual circumstances and personalities. Some women chafed at their restrictions and dreamed of different lives. Others embraced their roles and found fulfillment in them. The documentary record, diaries, letters, memoirs, reveals a complex range of responses that resist simple generalization. What's undeniable is the physical burden. Women's bodies wore out from childbearing, from endless labour, from poor nutrition and inadequate medical care. A woman who married in her early 20s might bear 6, 8, 10 children over the following 2 decades, each pregnancy weakening her body, each birth risking her life. By their 40s, many women were prematurely aged, their health broken by decades of work and reproduction. Life expectancy for women was lower than for men, partly because of childbirth mortality, but also because of the cumulative toll of their labour. You watch the women in your household, mother, sisters, aunts, grandmothers, moving through their endless tasks with a competence so practised it seems almost effortless. But you see the lines on their faces, the roughness of their hands, the way they lower themselves carefully into the chairs at the end of long days. Their work sustains everything, literally everything that keeps this household functioning, and yet it's so interwoven with daily life that it becomes almost invisible. Tonight, after the last dish is washed and the last child is tucked in, they'll fall into the beds they made this morning and sleep the heavy sleep of the thoroughly exhausted. Tomorrow it all begins again. We cannot journey through the 1850s without confronting the institution that defined and distorted American life, slavery. 4 million human beings lived in bondage across the southern states, their labour extracted by violence, their humanity denied by law and custom, their existence a moral catastrophe that America chose for decades not to address. Any romanticised portrait of 1850s daily life that omits or minimises slavery would be not just incomplete, but dishonest. If you were an enslaved person in 1850s America, your day began not with a rooster's crow, but with a bell, a horn, or an overseer's shout, signals that you had no choice but to obey. You rose in a cabin that might house 10 or 12 people in a single room, sleeping on bare floors or crude pallets, your only warmth coming from whatever fire could be maintained in a rough hearth. The clothes you wore were issued by your owner, typically 2 sets per year, summer and winter, made from coarse, cheap fabric that wore out before replacement arrived. Shoes were a similar ration, often fitting poorly, leaving feet blistered and damaged from fieldwork in mill-suited footwear. Breakfast, if provided, might be cornmeal mush and molasses, maybe some salt pork, rations calculated to provide enough calories for hard labour at minimal cost. Some enslaved people supplemented official rations by maintaining small garden plots, fishing, hunting small game, or trading amongst themselves, but these additions were uncertain and always subject to the owner's permission. Malnutrition was common, particularly among children, and especially visible in the stunted growth and poor health that many enslaved people exhibited. The work itself varied by location and season, but was universally grueling. On cotton plantations, the dominant form of southern agriculture by the 1850s, enslaved people planted, tended, and harvested the crop under close supervision. During picking season, each worker was assigned a daily quota, typically measured in pounds, and failure to meet that quota meant punishment. The standard punishment was whipping, brutal, bloody beatings administered with braided leather or knotted rope. But the arsenal of violence included branding, mutilation, extended confinement, and torture limited only by the imagination of sadistic overseers and owners. Here's a mainstream historical fact that quantifies the economic stakes. By 1860, the value of enslaved people in America exceeded the value of all the nation's railroads, factories, and banks combined. Slavery wasn't a marginal institution or a dying tradition. It was the economic engine driving national prosperity, its cotton exports providing the currency that financed American imports and fueled northern industry. The entire economy, North and South, was entangled with slavery in ways that made abolition economically disruptive and politically explosive. The psychological horror compounded the physical brutality. Enslaved people could be sold at any time, separated from spouses, children, parents, and friends, with no possibility of reunion. Children were sold away from mothers, husbands from wives, entire communities destroyed by market transactions that treated human beings as commodities. The trauma of these separations echoed through generations, a wound that slavery inflicted deliberately as a control mechanism. The threat of sale disciplined the enslaved population as effectively as the whip. Here's a detail that might seem small, but reveals the totality of dehumanization. Enslaved people were typically forbidden to learn to read. Literacy was dangerous. It allowed communication, organization, access to abolitionist literature, and southern states passed laws criminalizing the teaching of reading to enslaved people. This deliberate ignorance enforcement wasn't just about control. It was about denying the full humanity of people whose humanity, if acknowledged, would render slavery obviously monstrous. And yet, and this is where the story becomes more than horror, enslaved people maintained their humanity through extraordinary acts of resistance, creativity, and community. They created music that would eventually transform American culture. Spirituals, work songs, the foundations of blues and jazz. They maintained family structures and kinship networks despite the constant threat of separation, creating fictive kin relationships that provided support when blood families were torn apart. They practiced religions that blended African traditions with Christianity, finding in the story of the Israelites' liberation from Egypt a promise of their own eventual freedom. They resisted in ways large and small, working slowly, breaking tools, feigning illness, running away, and occasionally rising in armed rebellion. Historians still argue about aspects of slavery's daily reality, how much autonomy enslaved people carved out within the system, how resistance functioned and how effective it was, how the experience varied across different types of labour and different regions. What no serious historian disputes is that slavery was a vast crime, sustained by violence, motivated by greed, and enabled by a society that constructed elaborate justifications for the unjustifiable. The 1850s were years of escalating conflict over slavery's future. The Compromise of 1850 temporarily resolved territorial disputes, but satisfied no one fully. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 ignited violent conflict in Kansas as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers fought for control. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 ruled that black people could never be citizens and that Congress could not prohibit slavery in the territories. Tensions ratcheted higher each year, pointing toward the conflagration that would come in the following decade. Living in the 1850s meant living in a nation careening toward catastrophe over slavery, even if most people going about their daily lives preferred not to think too hard about it. The southern planter enjoying his morning coffee was drinking the proceeds of human bondage. The northern merchant selling cotton goods was profiting from enslaved labour. The ordinary white American, north or south, benefited from an economy built on stolen lives and forced work. Complicity was structural, even when individual conscience might have wished otherwise. We move forward in our journey carrying this knowledge, that the America of the 1850s, for all its ordinary moments of work and rest and family and community, was fundamentally stained by an institution of monstrous evil. The people who lived through it made choices, as people always do, and many chose wrongly. Those who chose to resist, enslaved people who ran, white abolitionists who aided them, ordinary people who refused complicity, remind us that even in the darkest times moral courage was possible. Alongside the horror of slavery, and often obscured by it, existed vibrant communities of free black Americans who carved out lives of dignity, achievement and resistance in a nation that offered them neither full citizenship nor consistent protection. By 1850, roughly 500,000 free black people lived in the United States, concentrated in northern cities and certain southern communities, navigating a maze of legal restrictions, social discrimination, and constant threat with remarkable resilience. How did free black communities come to exist in a slave nation? Some had been freed by owners who, for various reasons, religious conviction, personal affection, deathbed conscience, manumitted their enslaved workers. Others had purchased their own freedom, accumulating money through extra work over years or decades until they could buy themselves from bondage. Some descended from people freed generations earlier, in the gradual emancipation processes that ended slavery in northern states after the Revolution. And some had simply run away and built new lives in places where they could pass as free, always looking over their shoulders for slave catchers in and cities like Philadelphia, Boston, New York, and Baltimore. Free black communities built remarkable institutions. Churches formed the centre of community life. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, established in 1816, was entirely black-led and provided spiritual guidance, mutual aid, education, and organising infrastructure. These churches were more than places of worship. They were hubs of community activity, places where news was shared, assistance was organised, and collective action was planned. Here's a mainstream historical fact that reveals both achievement and limitation. By the 1850s, free black Americans had established hundreds of churches, dozens of newspapers, numerous mutual aid societies, and multiple schools and educational institutions, all created and maintained by black community effort. These achievements occurred despite systematic exclusion from white institutions, despite legal barriers, despite violence and harassment. They demonstrated that given any opportunity at all, black Americans could and did build thriving communities. The legal restrictions facing free black Americans were extensive and varied by state. In most of the South, free black people faced requirements to register with local authorities, obtain permits for travel, avoid certain occupations, and prove their free status on demand. Failure to produce freedom papers could result in arrest and sale into slavery. Even in the North, black Americans couldn't vote in most states, couldn't serve on juries, couldn't testify against white people in court, couldn't attend white schools, and faced segregation in public accommodations. The ideology of white supremacy that justified slavery extended to encompass free black people as well, marking them as inferior regardless of their legal status. Here's a quirky detail that shows both the creativity of black entrepreneurs and the hostile environment they navigated. Black barbershops became significant businesses and community institutions. Barbering was one occupation open to black men that could serve white customers, and successful barbers sometimes became relatively wealthy community figures. Their shops served as gathering places for black communities. spaces where news circulated and connections were made. Some barbers became conductors on the Underground Railroad, using their businesses as cover for aiding escaped enslaved people. The threat of kidnapping hung over every free black American. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 required Northern cooperation in capturing escaped enslaved people, but it also enabled the kidnapping of legally free black people into slavery through fraudulent claims and corrupt officials. A free black man walking the streets of Philadelphia might be seized by slave catchers claiming he was an escaped slave from Virginia, dragged before a commissioner who received higher fees for ruling in favor of slaveholders, and shipped south into bondage with no effective legal recourse. The terror this created was real and pervasive. No free black American could feel entirely secure. Community organizations emerged to combat this threat. Vigilance committees in northern cities maintained networks of lawyers, safe houses, and armed defenders ready to protect their communities from kidnappers. These committees tracked the movements of suspected slave catchers, warned potential victims, and occasionally organized rescues, breaking accused fugitives out of custody before they could be shipped south. Such actions were technically illegal, but they expressed a community determination to protect its members by whatever means necessary. Education was both a community priority and a point of conflict. Free black communities established schools where their children could learn, despite exclusion from white public schools. These schools varied in quality but represented enormous investment of scarce community resources. White opposition to black education was often fierce. Schools were sometimes burned or vandalized, and teachers threatened or attacked. The message was clear: black advancement through education threatened white supremacy and would be resisted. Historians still argue about how to characterize the relative position of free black Americans in the 1850s. Some emphasize the achievements, the institutions built, the businesses established, the communities maintained against enormous odds. Others emphasize the precariousness, the constant threat, the legal disabilities, the vulnerability to violence and injustice. Both perspectives capture important truths. Free black Americans in the 1850s lived in a kind of half-freedom that was better than slavery but far from equality, a position that required constant navigation of dangers and limitations. Among free black communities, the abolitionist movement found some of its most committed activists. Frederick Douglass, himself an escaped slave, published his newspaper The North Star and spoke to massive audiences about slavery's evils. Harriet Tubman repeatedly returned to the South to guide enslaved people to freedom along the Underground Railroad. Sojourner Truth combined abolition with women's rights advocacy, delivering speeches that challenged multiple forms of oppression. These figures became famous, but they were supported by thousands of ordinary free black Americans who donated money, sheltered fugitives, and took risks that rarely made the history books. Walking through a free black neighborhood in Philadelphia or Boston in the 1850s, you would see churches with active congregations, schools with eager students, shops with skilled proprietors, newspapers reporting community news, families going about their lives with whatever dignity they could maintain. It wasn't equality, and it wasn't safety, but it was community, proof that even under the most adverse conditions, human beings create meaning, build institutions, and sustain each other. That communities' descendants would eventually transform America, but that transformation lay far in the future. For now, they lived day by day, resisted as they could, and hoped. The ships arriving at eastern ports, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, carry human cargo of a different sort. Immigrants, hundreds of thousands of them annually during the 1850s, flooding into an America that simultaneously needs their labor and resents their presence. These newcomers are transforming the nation's cities, its culture and its politics in ways that the native-born population finds alternately exciting and terrifying. The Irish constitute the largest single immigrant group, their numbers swelled by the catastrophic potato famine of the 1840s that killed over 1 million people and drove another 1 million to emigrate. These famine refugees arrive impoverished, traumatized and desperate, carrying memories of mass death and British indifference that will shape Irish-American identity for generations. They crowd into the worst neighborhoods of major cities, the 5 Points of New York, the North End of Boston, where families of 10 or 12 squeeze into single rooms in tenement buildings designed to extract maximum rent from minimum space. The tenements themselves are a relatively new phenomenon. purpose-built apartment buildings that replaced the single-family homes and boarding houses of earlier urban housing. They rose quickly and cheaply, often without adequate ventilation, sanitation, or fire protection. Narrow lots meant narrow buildings with dark interior rooms receiving no natural light. Shared privies in the rear courtyard served dozens of families. Water came from communal pumps often contaminated by proximity to cesspools. The conditions bred disease, cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, that swept through immigrant neighborhoods with terrible regularity. Here's a mainstream historical fact about immigration's scale. Between 1845 and 1855, approximately 3 million immigrants arrived in America, mostly from Ireland and the German states. This was the largest proportional immigration the nation had ever experienced, adding roughly 12 to 15% to the total population in a single decade. The demographic impact was staggering, particularly in northeastern cities where immigrants concentrated. German immigrants, the second largest group, arrived for somewhat different reasons. Political upheaval following failed revolutions in 1848 drove many educated Germans to emigrate, bringing professional skills, political ideologies, and cultural traditions that distinguished them from the mostly rural Catholic Irish. German immigrants more often settled in the Midwest, establishing communities in Cincinnati, St. Louis, Milwaukee, and smaller cities throughout the region. They brought brewing expertise, the American lager beer industry is largely a German immigrant creation, as well as distinct architectural styles, musical traditions, and social organizations like the Turnverein gymnastic clubs. The native-born response to immigration ranged from welcome to violent hostility. Employers appreciated the cheap labor that immigrants provided, undercutting native-born workers' wages and filling dangerous, unpleasant jobs. But working-class native-born Americans saw immigrants as competitors, threatening their livelihoods. And cultural anxieties ran deep. The Irish were Catholic in a nation with deep Protestant traditions, speaking English with unfamiliar accents, practicing customs that seemed foreign and threatening. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the era's prejudices. No Irish need apply signs in shop windows were common enough to become a symbol of discrimination, though historians debate exactly how widespread they were. Irish men were caricatured as drunken, violent, and stupid. Irish women as slovenly and immoral. These stereotypes justified discrimination in housing and employment while providing a target for popular anger that might otherwise have focused on the economic system creating poverty and inequality. The Know-Nothing movement emerged during the 1850s as an explicitly anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic political force. Formerly known as the American Party, it derived its nickname from members' habit of claiming to know nothing when asked about its secretive structure. Know-Nothings proposed extending the waiting period for citizenship from 5 to 21 years, barring immigrants and Catholics from public office, and otherwise restricting immigrant influence on American politics. The movement achieved significant electoral success in the mid-1850s before fragmenting over the slavery issue, but its nativist sentiment would recur repeatedly in American history. Living conditions in immigrant neighborhoods were as difficult as anything we've discussed about rural poverty, but concentrated and intensified by urban density. The tenement room that was your entire living space, sleeping, cooking, eating, working, might measure 10 feet by 12 feet, into which a family of 8 crammed whatever possessions they'd managed to bring or acquire. Privacy didn't exist, neither did quiet or clean air, or safety from fire that could sweep through these wooden buildings with catastrophic speed. Disease transmission was facilitated by crowding. Industrial pollution fouled the air and water. Crime and violence were endemic in neighborhoods where poverty bred desperation. And yet immigrants created community in these conditions, just as free black Americans created community under their constraints. Mutual aid societies provided insurance against death, disability, and unemployment when no government programs existed. Churches, Catholic parishes for the Irish, Lutheran and Catholic churches for Germans, provided spiritual sustenance and social services. Ethnic newspapers kept communities informed in their native languages. Political organizations mobilized immigrant voters to demand attention from city governments. The wards of the 5 Points might be squalid, but they were also vibrant, full of saloons and shops and street life that reflected distinct cultures being transplanted and transformed in American soil. Historians still argue about whether immigration improved or worsened the lives of those who came. Certainly, conditions in the famine-ravaged Irish countryside or politically unstable German states were terrible enough to make emigration worthwhile despite its costs. Certainly, immigrants' descendants would integrate into American society and eventually prosper, but the first generation often paid a heavy price: shortened lives, brutal labour, discrimination and violence that should complicate any narrative of immigration as a simply opportunity and success. You might encounter immigrants throughout your 1850s journey. The Irish servant girl in a middle-class household, the German farmer settling western land, the Italian street vendor, the Chinese labourer beginning to arrive on the Pacific coast. Each brings a different story, a different reason for coming, a different relationship with the America they find. Together, they're building a nation that is increasingly diverse, increasingly urban, increasingly different from the agrarian republic the founders imagined. That nation is the one you now inhabit, strange and familiar all at once. Sunday arrives, and the rhythms of the week shift into a different register. This is the Sabbath. And in 1850s America, that means something far more profound and universal than the casual weekend relaxation of modern life. For most Americans, Sunday is sacred, a day set apart for worship, rest, and spiritual reflection, observed with a seriousness that crossed denominational lines and shaped the entire culture. You rise later than other days, not because you're sleeping in for pleasure, but because the morning chores have been minimized. Animals still need basic care, but discretionary work stops. No ploughing, no laundry, no commercial transactions, no loud recreation. Blue laws in many states legally prohibited businesses from operating on Sundays, banned certain activities, and created an enforced quiet that descended on communities from Saturday evening through Sunday night. The centerpiece of Sunday is church, and attending church means preparing with unusual care. You put on your best clothes, the Sunday best that's reserved for precisely this occasion. Nicer fabrics, better condition, more careful grooming than the workaday week permits. Women wear their finest dresses, perhaps with bonnets trimmed with ribbons. Men wear suits or their closest approximation. Children, too, are scrubbed and dressed, their faces washed and hair combed, their behaviour expected to achieve unprecedented standards of stillness and silence. The walk to church, and for most people it is a walk, sometimes several miles, is a social occasion in itself. You encounter neighbours similarly dressed and bound, exchanging greetings and news along the way. The church building rises ahead, perhaps a simple wooden structure in rural areas or an imposing stone edifice in towns, its steeple visible for miles as a landmark orienting the community. Here's a mainstream historical fact about 1850s religious practice. The United States was in the midst of what historians call the Second Great Awakening, a decades-long wave of religious revival that fundamentally shaped American Christianity. The movement emphasized personal conversion, emotional religious experience, and active participation in moral reform. It spawned new denominations, Mormons, Adventists, various perfectionist sects, and energized existing ones. Camp meetings gathered thousands for days of preaching, singing, and spiritual intensity. The religious enthusiasm of the era touched every aspect of life. Inside the church you find your pew. Families often rented specific pews, their payments supporting the church and their locations advertising social status, and settle in for a service that might last 2, 3, even or 4 hours. The sermon is the centerpiece, and preachers of the era were entertainers as much as theologians, their oratory designed to hold attention through extended discourse. Hell was preached vividly, heaven promised lavishly, and the choice between them laid urgently before congregations exhorted to repent, believe, and reform. Here's a quirky detail about church seating that reveals social hierarchies. In many congregations, black members, whether free northern black families or enslaved southern black people accompanying their owners, were required to sit separately, often in rear pews or balconies. Churches that claimed spiritual equality before God practiced earthly segregation, a contradiction that abolitionists pointed out and that eventually contributed to the formation of separate black churches where congregations could worship with dignity. The music of 1850s worship ranged from austere to exuberant depending on denomination and region. Some churches sang only psalms, without instrumental accompaniment, in the austere tradition of Reformed Protestantism. Others embraced hymns, the compositions of Isaac Watts, Charles Wesley, and more recent writers, sung with harmonized enthusiasm. Some black churches developed the spirituals that would become one of America's most significant musical contributions, songs that layered religious meaning with coded references to freedom and escape. A piano or organ might accompany singing in wealthier churches, while rural congregations made do with a pitch pipe and human voices alone. After the service, the social function of Sunday continued. Families gathered at the homes of relatives for Sunday dinner, often the most elaborate meal of the week, featuring meat that was reserved for special occasions and desserts that required precious sugar and careful preparation. Visiting occupied the afternoon, calling on neighbours, receiving callers, the intricate social choreography of a society where connections mattered enormously and were maintained through face-to-face interaction. Strict Sabbath observers prohibited various activities that modern people wouldn't think twice about. Reading secular literature might be forbidden. Only the Bible and religious works were appropriate for Sunday. Games and sports were prohibited in many households. Travel for purposes other than church attendance was frowned upon or explicitly banned. The goal was to set Sunday apart so completely that its different quality reinforced its sacred significance. Historians still argue about how sincerely the average American observed Sabbath restrictions and how much compliance was social performance rather than genuine conviction. Certainly, enforcement varied. Young men gathered for forbidden games in secluded locations. Travellers found ways to continue journeys, and the line between permitted and prohibited activities was constantly negotiated. But the cultural expectation of Sunday observance was nearly universal, and deviating visibly risked social censure. The religious culture of the 1850s was not monolithic. Alongside the Protestant mainstream existed Catholic parishes serving immigrant populations, Jewish congregations in urban centres, and various smaller religious communities practicing faiths that diverged from dominant Christianity. These minorities faced varying degrees of acceptance and persecution. Catholics particularly were targets of Protestant suspicion and occasional violence. Religious freedom was the official American principle, but social pressure strongly favoured Protestant Christianity. As Sunday afternoon fades toward evening, you might attend a second church service, or participate in family Bible reading, or simply sit quietly in the fading light, contemplating the week past and the week ahead. The workday world, suspended for these hours, awaits Monday's return. But for now, wrapped in the quiet of the Sabbath, there's space for something other than labour and survival, space for reflection, connection, and whatever relationship with the divine feels meaningful to you. The church bell rings the evening hour, and you prepare for the early night that precedes another dawn of work. The rituals of courtship in 1850s America follow strict rules, unwritten but universally understood, that would seem almost comically formal to modern daters, and yet within those rules, genuine affection found ways to flourish. If you're of marriageable age during this decade, navigating romance means learning a complex choreography of signals, permissions, and carefully staged encounters. Young people of opposite sexes rarely interacted without some form of supervision. A young man interested in a young woman couldn't simply approach her on the street or send her a text message. He had to follow proper channels. This typically meant obtaining an introduction through mutual acquaintances, then requesting permission to call at her family's home. If the family approved, and they might not depending on the young man's reputation, economic prospects, and social standing, he could visit during designated calling hours, sitting in the parlour under the watchful eye of a parent or older relative. Here's a mainstream historical fact about courtship economics. Marriage in the 1850s was an economic arrangement as much as a romantic one. A woman marrying surrendered her legal identity and property rights to her husband. She needed to choose someone who could provide economic security. A man marrying acquired responsibility for supporting a wife and future children. He needed to be established enough to do so credibly. Romantic love was hoped for and increasingly celebrated in popular culture, but practical considerations remained paramount. A love match that ignored economic reality was considered foolish, even irresponsible. The calling ritual allowed both parties and their families to assess compatibility through a series of supervised conversations. These conversations were constrained by the presence of chaperones, but still provided opportunity to evaluate personality, intelligence, humour, and values. A skillful young woman could steer conversations toward revealing topics, A perceptive young man could demonstrate wit and sensitivity within the bounds of propriety. What couldn't happen was physical intimacy. Any touch beyond a handshake was scandalous, and a young woman's reputation depended on avoiding even the appearance of impropriety. Here's a quirky detail about communication within these constraints: the language of flowers. Since open emotional expression was discouraged, suitors communicated through symbolic floral gifts. Red roses meant love. Yellow roses signified friendship or jealousy depending on context. Violets suggested faithfulness. Forget-me-nots were self-explanatory. Complex bouquets could convey nuanced messages to recipients who understood the code. This floral vocabulary was documented in popular flower dictionaries that both sender and recipient might consult. If courtship progressed favourably, the young man would eventually request permission to court officially, essentially asking the family's blessing to pursue marriage. If granted, he became the young woman's acknowledged suitor, with increased, though still limited, access and clearer expectations. The couple might now walk together in public, attend social events as a pair, and sit somewhat closer during calls. Physical contact remained minimal, perhaps hand-holding, perhaps a brief touching of hands during dancing, but emotional intimacy could deepen through continued conversation and correspondence. Letter writing played a crucial role in courtship, especially when distance separated couples. The letters that survive from this era reveal people capable of deep, feeling and eloquent expression, their emotions perhaps intensified by the constraints that prevented physical expression. A man might pour his heart into pages of careful penmanship. A woman might compose replies that balanced encouragement with modesty. These letters were treasured, saved, and sometimes passed down through generations as evidence of great-grandparents' love. Engagement formalized the intention to marry but didn't immediately precede the wedding. Engagements might last months or years while the couple accumulated resources, the man established himself in business or farming, and practical arrangements were made. During this engagement, the couple could interact more freely, perhaps even exchange a kiss, but society still expected them to avoid anything that might anticipate the marriage, as the euphemism went. A woman who became pregnant before marriage faced severe social consequences. The man might face pressure to marry immediately, but the shame fell. Disproportionately on her, the wedding itself varied enormously by class and region. Wealthy families staged elaborate affairs with large guest lists, expensive food and fashionable clothing. Poor families might simply exchange vows before a minister or justice of the peace, with a few witnesses present. The legal essence was the same: the exchange of promises, the signing of a marriage certificate, but the surrounding ceremony ranged from bare minimum to ostentatious display. Historians still argue about how much choice women actually had in marriage decisions. Legally, a woman could refuse to marry anyone she didn't want, but practical pressures were immense. Remaining single meant economic vulnerability. Few occupations were open to women, and wages were low. A woman who rejected too many suitors might find herself without options, labelled too particular or somehow defective. The theoretical freedom to choose masked considerable coercion embedded in the economic and social structure. Once married, couples faced the challenges of building a life together. Young wives moved into their husbands' households, sometimes into houses shared with in-laws, which created its own tensions, and assumed domestic responsibilities for which they may or may not have been fully prepared. Young husbands worked to support their new families, the economic pressure intensifying with each child born. Romantic love, if present, had to survive the strains of daily struggle, the losses of children and health, the accumulating weight of years. And yet love survived, sometimes flourished. Diaries describe couples who remained devoted across decades, who mourned each other's deaths with genuine devastation, who found in their partners not just economic necessity but genuine companionship and affection. The courtship rituals that seem so stilted to modern eyes served a purpose. They created time and space for people to know each other before committing to shared lives, and while the system was imperfect and patriarchal, it wasn't entirely devoid of romance. Somewhere in your 1850s life, perhaps, there's a person who catches your eye across a room, who inspires your careful inquiry about proper introduction, who receives your first nervous call in a parlour thick with chaperone supervision. What happens next follows rules you didn't make but must navigate. Rules that might lead, if fortune favours, to a love that lasts a lifetime. With work filling most of every day and formal religious observance commanding Sundays, the question arises, when and how did 1850s Americans have fun? The answer reveals a culture of entertainment quite different from modern leisure. More participatory, more community-centred, and more dependent on making your own amusement rather than consuming professionally produced content. The barn dance was perhaps the most iconic social entertainment of rural America. These gatherings brought communities together in someone's barn or large, whole for an evening of music, dancing and socialising. A fiddle player, sometimes accompanied by a banjo, a squeeze box, or just foot-stomping rhythm, provided music for reels, jigs and square dances called by a designated caller whose job was to direct the intricate patterns. Allemande left, do-si-do, promenade your partner. You didn't need formal dance training. You learned by watching and doing, absorbed the basic patterns, and joined in the swirling energy. Here's a mainstream historical fact about entertainment accessibility. Unlike modern entertainment, which requires purchasing tickets or subscriptions, most 1850s recreation was either free or very cheap. Barn dances cost nothing if someone donated the space. Singing societies charged nominal dues. Reading aloud from newspapers was free once the newspaper was purchased. Entertainment was produced locally by community members, not imported from professional entertainment industries. Quilting bees served a dual purpose: productive labour and social gathering. Women assembled at a host's home, bringing their sewing skills to complete a quilt top that the host had pieced together. As they stitched, they talked, sharing news, advice, gossip and companionship in an era when women's social opportunities were limited. The completed quilt was practical output, but the conversation was the real point. Similar events, sewing circles, apple paring bees, corn husking competitions, combined necessary work with social interaction, making labour bearable through community. Reading aloud was a primary form of family entertainment. In the evening, after supper and before bed, families gathered while one member, often a parent, read from newspapers, magazines or books. Serialized fiction was enormously popular. Novels by Charles Dickens first reached American audiences as magazine installments read aloud in parlours across the nation. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, became the cultural phenomenon partly through this reading aloud tradition, its emotional scenes bringing tears to listeners who might never read the book themselves. Here's a quirky detail about 1850s publishing. Newspapers included far more than news. A typical newspaper of the era might contain poems on the front page, serialized fiction running for weeks, essays on every topic from farming advice to philosophical speculation, and humour columns that ranged from gentle wit to crude slapstick. The newspaper was a general entertainment medium, the closest thing to television that the era possessed, and families pored over every section looking for content to discuss. Singing was ubiquitous. People sang at church, sang at home, sang at social gatherings, sang while working. Hymnals and songbooks were common possessions. Knowing hundreds of songs by heart was normal. Families might gather around a piano or pump organ if they owned one, or simply sing unaccompanied, their voices blending in. Harmonies learned from childhood. Stephen Foster's songs, Oh, Susanna, Camptown Races, Beautiful Dreamer, were spreading across America during the 1850s, becoming shared cultural property that everyone recognized. Storytelling remained important in an era before recorded entertainment. Older relatives told stories of their youth, of the Revolution, of frontier adventures, of family legends accumulated over generations. These stories transmitted history, values and identity. They connected present generations to past ones and established continuity that written records alone couldn't provide. A skilled storyteller commanded attention at any gathering. Their tales shaped and polished through years of repetition. Games and sports occupied children and adults in their leisure moments. Card games and board games provided indoor entertainment. Checkers and chess were popular, as were various card games that had migrated from Europe. Outdoor games ranged from children's play, tag, hide-and-seek various ball games, to organised competitions that prefigured modern sports. Baseball was emerging during the 1850s, with clubs forming in New York and other cities, rules being codified, and the game spreading through communities that found it exciting and accessible. The circus came to town occasionally, travelling shows featuring acrobats, trained animals, clowns, and curiosities that drew audiences from miles around. These were events of genuine wonder. Many rural Americans had never seen an elephant, a lion, or performers capable of the athletic feats circus acts displayed. The arrival of a circus was anticipated for weeks, attended by thousands, and discussed for months afterward. Lectures and debates provided intellectual entertainment. The Lyceum movement brought speakers to communities across America, offering talks on science, philosophy, history, and reform. Abolitionists, temperance advocates, and other reformers used the lecture circuit to spread their messages. Attending a lecture was both entertainment and self-improvement, a chance to hear ideas and arguments that might not otherwise reach your community. Historians still argue about whether 1850s Americans had more or less leisure time than their descendants. The question is complicated because the boundaries between work and leisure were different. Was a quilting bee work or fun? Was singing while churning butter labour or entertainment? The modern division of life into work time and free time was less sharp, and moments of enjoyment were woven through activities that were simultaneously productive. What's clear is that entertainment was participatory in ways modern entertainment rarely is. You didn't watch professionals perform, you performed yourself or listened to neighbours and friends perform. You didn't consume content passively. You actively created it through conversation, singing, game-playing and storytelling. The skills involved, musicianship, narrative ability, social grace, were developed through practice and valued by communities. As you settle into an evening's entertainment, perhaps a neighbour playing fiddle while others dance, perhaps gathered around as someone reads the latest instalment of a novel, you're participating in traditions that stretch back generations and forward toward whatever future entertainment will become. The firelight flickers, the music plays, and for these few hours the work is forgotten. News of the wider world reaches you slowly, filtered through channels that modern instantaneity has made almost incomprehensible. In the 1850s, information moves at the speed of horses, ships, and the newfangled telegraph wires that are just beginning to web across the continent. Understanding how people learned what was happening beyond their immediate communities reveals both the isolation and the connectedness of 1850s American life. The newspaper is your primary window to the wider world. Weekly newspapers serve most communities, bringing news that's already days or weeks old by the time it reaches your hands. Daily papers exist in major cities, but their reach extends only as far as distribution networks can carry them. You read about events in Washington, developments in Europe, disasters and discoveries and human interest stories from everywhere. All of it delayed, all of it filtered through editors whose biases shape what's included and how it's framed. Here's a mainstream historical fact about 1850s newspapers. They were fiercely partisan in ways that modern journalism claims to have abandoned. Papers openly aligned with political parties, slanted coverage accordingly, and made no pretense of objectivity. A Democratic paper and a Whig paper in the same city might describe the same event in completely contradictory terms. Readers understood this and chose their papers accordingly, seeking confirmation of their political views rather than neutral information. The ideal of journalistic objectivity would emerge later, a response to the yellow journalism that this era was helping to create. The telegraph was transforming communication at precisely this moment. Samuel Morse's invention, demonstrated in the 1840s, was rapidly expanding, with wires connecting major cities and reaching toward the frontier. For the first time in human history, information could travel faster than physical objects. News of events in New York could reach Philadelphia or Baltimore within hours rather than days. The phrase breaking news became possible because news could actually break, arrive suddenly, without the delay inherent in physical transportation. Here's a quirky detail about telegraph usage. The costs were initially so high that only the most urgent messages justified the expense. Personal correspondence still went by mail, business messages that could wait a day travelled by letter. The telegraph was reserved for news urgent enough to pay premium rates, which meant financial. Information, stock prices, commodity markets, news of major events, battles, disasters, elections, and personal emergencies, deaths, urgent family matters. The brief, clipped style of telegram writing, every word cost money, so brevity was essential, would influence communication habits for generations. Letter writing remained the primary form of personal long-distance communication. You sat down with paper, pen and ink to compose letters to relatives, friends and business contacts, knowing that your words would take days or weeks to arrive and that a response would require similarly patient waiting. The letters that survive from this era are often surprisingly literary. People took care with their correspondence, understanding that letters might be saved, shared and reread for years. The postal system made this communication possible, and its development during the 1850s was expanding access significantly. Standardized postage rates, the introduction of postage stamps, and expanding postal routes brought mail service to communities that had previously been beyond reliable reach. Sending a letter cost a few cents, affordable for most people, though not trivial for the poorest. Receiving mail was an event, post office visits were anticipated, and letters from distant correspondents were treasured. Books circulated through various channels. Public libraries as we know them were just emerging. The first tax-supported public library opened in Boston in 1854. Before that, subscription libraries required membership fees, and circulating libraries lent books for rental fees. Many people simply couldn't afford books and depended on borrowed copies, shared among friends and neighbours until they fell apart from handling. The bestsellers of the era, Uncle Tom's Cabin, various sentimental novels, religious works, achieved their status through word of mouth and reading aloud transmission as much as through individual purchases. Magazines provided another information source, their monthly or quarterly publication schedules bringing serialized fiction, essays, illustrations, and specialized content to subscribers. Literary magazines like Harper's, Atlantic Monthly, and Godey's Lady's Book shaped cultural tastes and spread ideas across the literate population. Magazine subscriptions were marks of cultural aspiration. Displaying current issues in your parlour signalled education and refinement. Travellers brought news personally, their accounts of distant places eagerly received by those who would never make such journeys themselves. A neighbour, returning from New York City, could describe the buildings, the crowds, the spectacles in ways that print couldn't capture. A relative emigrating to California might send letters describing the journey that took months, and the strange new world found at the end. These personal accounts supplemented printed news with texture and detail that journalism couldn't provide. Historians still argue about how informed 1850s Americans actually were about events beyond their communities. Literacy rates were high by historical standards, most white Americans could read, but access to information varied by location, class and interest. Some people followed national events closely, debating policy with sophisticated understanding. Others focused entirely on local concerns and knew little of the wider world. The information environment was uneven in ways that modern ubiquitous connectivity makes difficult to imagine. The coming civil war would be reported through these channels, newspapers arriving days after battles, telegraph dispatches bringing fragments of urgent news, letters from soldiers describing what newspapers couldn't or wouldn't print. The information infrastructure of the 1850s would be tested by the greatest crisis in American history, and it would prove both essential and inadequate to the task of keeping a nation informed about itself. For now, you unfold the newspaper, scan the headlines, and try to make sense of a world that extends far beyond what you can see or experience directly. The information is incomplete, delayed and biased, but it's what you have, and from it you construct an understanding of your time and place that shapes how you live and what you believe. Evening descends, and the world transforms. Without electric lights, darkness means something profoundly different than modern people experience, not an inconvenience to be banished with a switch, but a condition that shapes behaviour, limits activity, and returns each night with the inevitability of seasons. The rituals of nightfall in 1850s America are as distinct as those of morning, and as the light fades, you navigate them with practiced ease. The transition begins with lighting, candles, oil lamps, and increasingly during this decade, kerosene lamps that provide brighter, steadier illumination than their predecessors. You move through the house lighting wicks, adjusting flames, positioning lamps to cast light where activity will continue. The light they produce is warm in colour temperature, soft-edged and inadequate by modern standards. Reading requires holding the book close to the lamp, and shadows pool in corners that remain essentially dark regardless of how many lights you burn. Here's a mainstream historical fact about artificial lighting. Before kerosene became widely available in the late 1850s, most Americans used candles or whale oil lamps. The whaling industry, those famous ships sailing from Nantucket and New Bedford, existed largely to supply the oil that lit American homes. Candles made from tallow, animal fat, or beeswax provided cheaper alternatives, but candles flickered, needed constant trimming, and produced relatively little light. Kerosene, refined from petroleum, would revolutionize home lighting, providing brighter light more cheaply, and helping push whaling toward obsolescence. Supper, the evening meal, is lighter than these. Midday dinner, perhaps bread and cheese, leftover dishes from earlier ideal, or simple preparations that don't require extensive cooking. The day's hard work has depleted energy reserves, and the priority now is rest rather than elaborate dining. Family members gather once more around the table, eat relatively quickly, and prepare for the evening's quieter activities. What do you do when darkness limits outdoor work and even indoor activities strain against inadequate light? This is the time for family togetherness, the reading aloud we discussed, the singing and conversation, the quiet companionship of people who have worked hard and now rest together. Children might play quiet games or listen to stories. Adults might attend to small tasks that don't require bright light, knitting, whittling, mending to by feel rather than sight. The evening stretches long in winter, short in summer, its duration set by the sun's schedule rather than any human preference. Here's a quirky detail about evening routines. Many Americans in the 1850s practiced first sleep and second sleep, a pattern that historical research has revealed as common before artificial lighting changed our relationship with night. You would go to bed shortly after dark, sleep for several hours, wake for a period of quiet activity in the middle of the night, then return to sleep until morning. During the wakeful period, people might pray, meditate, talk with bed partners, or simply lie quietly in the darkness. This segmented sleep pattern was so normal that it rarely needed mentioning. Only after it disappeared did historians recognize that it had existed. Preparing for bed involves reversing the morning's dressing ordeal. Women remove the layers of garments, dresses, petticoats, corsets, and replace them with sleeping chemises. Men exchange day clothes for nightshirts. Shoes come off, hair comes down, and bodies ease into whatever sleeping arrangements the household provides. The elaborate hairstyles of the day, requiring pins and pomades and careful arrangement, are dismantled, hairbrushed and perhaps braided for sleep. The bedroom you enter might be private, your own small room or one shared only with your spouse, or might be communal, shared with siblings, children, or even strangers depending on circumstances. The bed itself might be comfortable enough, especially if you're prosperous enough to own a feather mattress, or might be barely tolerable, especially if you're on a corn husk pallet with insufficient blankets. Either way, you're tired enough to sleep despite imperfections. The sounds of the night are different from those of modern nights. No mechanical hum of appliances, no distant traffic noise, no electronic devices emitting their subtle frequencies. Instead, the creak of wooden house frames settling, the calls of nocturnal animals, the wind in the trees, your own breathing and heartbeat suddenly audible in the quiet. For people raised with constant background noise, this silence can be almost alarming. For 1850s Americans, it's simply how nights sound. The darkness, too, is different, deeper than modern darkness, which is always somewhat contaminated by electric light. On moonless nights, the darkness is complete enough to be disorienting. On moonlit nights, the moon provides genuine illumination, enough to navigate familiar spaces without artificial light. Stars blaze across the sky with a clarity that light pollution has stolen from most modern observers. The night sky of the 1850s is spectacular, the Milky Way clearly visible, meteor showers and planets and the slow turning of constellations all observable by anyone who looks up. Historians still argue about sleep quality and duration in the pre-industrial past. Some evidence suggests people slept more hours when darkness prevented other activities. Other evidence suggests the discomforts of the era: cold, vermin, chronic pain, reduced sleep quality despite longer sleep, opportunities. What's certain is that the modern separation of sleep from other life activities, the dedicated bedroom, the consistent schedule, the expectation of uninterrupted night sleep was still taking shape, influenced by industrialization's regularization of time. You pull the quilts up to your chin, feeling the weight of blankets your mother or grandmother stitched. The fire in the hearth, if you're fortunate enough to have a bedroom fireplace, burns low, its glow barely visible. Somewhere outside an owl calls, Somewhere inside, a family member coughs or shifts on creaking bed springs. The day is done, its labours complete, its small pleasures absorbed, and now comes the surrender to unconsciousness that will restore you for tomorrow's repetition of the whole cycle. Sleep, in the 1850s as in every era, is the great equalizer, the one experience that everyone shares, rich and poor alike, the nightly death and resurrection that punctuates every human life. Whatever tomorrow brings, tonight you rest. The wheel of the year turns slowly in 1850s America, marking time not by calendar pages or digital countdowns, but by the rhythms of planting and harvest, by holy days and seasonal celebrations, by the patterns of weather and work that have organised human life since agriculture began. You live embedded in these cycles, your sense of time shaped by forces larger than any clock. Spring arrives with the softening of frozen ground and the urgent imperative to plant. The earth that was solid for months becomes workable, and every daylight hour is consumed with the labour of preparing fields, ploughing, harrowing, seeding that cannot wait. Failure to plant on time means reduced harvests. Reduced harvests mean hunger. The pressure of spring work is intense, exhausting, and repeated each year without fail. Summer brings different rhythms, cultivation of growing crops, maintenance of animals that now graze on fresh pasture, preservation of the first fruits and vegetables as they ripen. The days stretch long, light, lasting past 8 or 9 in the evening, and work expands to fill the available hours. Heat can be brutal, especially for those labouring in fields or factories without modern cooling, but the abundance of fresh food compensates somewhat for the discomfort. Autumn is harvest, the climax of the agricultural year, the payoff for spring's planting and summer's tending. Crops come in with urgency, delay means loss to weather, to pests, to simple decay. The work is backbreaking but meaningful, the results of a year's labour finally tangible in barns full of grain, cellars full of vegetables, smokehouse full of meat from full butchering. Autumn is also accounting, figuring whether you've produced enough to survive winter, whether debts can be paid, whether the year's gamble on weather and markets has paid off or failed. Winter brings a different pace, slower but not truly restful. Indoor work replaces outdoor labour, equipment repair, handicraft production, processing of stored materials. The cold drives families inside, creates conditions for both connection and conflict, and demands constant attention to fire and fuel. The darkness of winter nights, stretching from late afternoon to mid-morning, enforces rest that summer's long days don't permit. Here's a mainstream historical fact about seasonal mortality. Death rates in the 1850s followed seasonal patterns now largely forgotten. Winter brought respiratory infections, influenza, pneumonia, tuberculosis exacerbations that killed the elderly and young disproportionately. Summer brought waterborne diseases, cholera, typhoid, dysentery that peaked when heat accelerated bacterial growth and contaminated water supplies. Communities tracked these patterns, knowing that certain times of year were more dangerous than others, praying for the healthy seasons while dreading the deadly ones. Death itself was a more present reality than modern Americans typically experience, with childhood mortality claiming roughly 1 in 5 children, with infectious diseases carrying off adults at every age. With accidents in farms and factories producing regular casualties, death was familiar, expected, and woven into the fabric of daily life. Families kept vigil with the dying, prepared bodies for burial, and mourned according to elaborate customs that acknowledged death's presence while managing its disruption. Here's a detail about mourning practices. Black clothing was the visual marker of grief, worn for prescribed periods that varied by relationship to the deceased. A widow might wear black for 2 years or more, other relatives for shorter periods scaled by closeness. These visible signs of mourning served social functions, signalling to the community that someone was grieving, excusing them from normal social obligations, warning others to treat them with appropriate sensitivity. Funerals were community events held in homes or churches, attended by neighbours who came to pay respects and support the bereaved. The body was typically displayed in a coffin, allowing mourners to view the deceased one final time. Burial followed in churchyards or family plots, the physical labour of grave digging sometimes performed by family and friends. The rituals acknowledged both the individual loss and community continuity, reminding the living that they too would someday lie in similar graves while life continued around them. Historians still argue about how 1850s Americans emotionally processed the constant proximity of death. Were they more accepting, more resigned, more capable of grief recovery than modern people who encounter death less frequently? Or did the sheer quantity of loss overwhelm coping mechanisms, leaving communities perpetually traumatized? The evidence suggests both. People developed rituals and perspectives that normalized death, but individual losses could still devastate, and some families never fully recovered from. Sequential tragedies. The community that surrounds you, neighbors, extended family, fellow church members, trading partners, provides the support network that makes survival possible. In an era without government safety nets, without insurance as we know it, without the institutional supports of modern life, community was everything. Neighbours helped with harvest, with house raising, with nursing the sick. Churches provided charity to the destitute. Mutual aid societies pooled resources against individual disaster. The relationships you maintained weren't just social pleasantries, they were survival infrastructure. And within that community, across the cycles of seasons and years, ordinary life unfolded. Children were born, grew, married, and had children of their own. Houses were built, fields were cleared, businesses were established. Small triumphs and small sorrows accumulated into lives that felt meaningful to those living them, even if history rarely recorded their names. The 1850s Americans you've been walking among, farmers and factory workers, mothers and children, enslaved people, and free black communities, immigrants and natives, were not footnotes to the great events of their era. They were the substance of that era, the millions of ordinary lives whose daily rhythms constituted what American actually was. As this journey draws toward its close, the farmhouse settles into evening quiet around you. The fire burns low, the last candle gutters, and beyond the window stars wheel slowly across a sky your descendants will never see so clearly. You're tired from a day's labour, satisfied with the day's small accomplishments, worried about tomorrow's uncertainties. You're one person among millions, your story untold except in the fading memories of those who loved you. You are America in 1850, in all its contradiction and complexity, its horror and hope, its daily struggle to survive and occasional moments of grace. The years ahead will bring catastrophe, a war that will kill over 600,000 Americans, end slavery's monstrous reign and transform the nation beyond recognition. You cannot know this, not yet, cannot see the storm clouds gathering just over the historical horizon. Tonight you know only this room, this bed, this moment of peace before sleep claims you. And now, as the last ember fades in the hearth, as the darkness deepens toward its most complete hour, let the details of this journey begin to soften and blur at their edges. The hard facts about mortality and labour, about hardship and hierarchy, can release their grip on your attention. What remains is simpler, gentler. The image of a house settling into night, of a sleeping family safe beneath the quilt stitched with love, of a world that, for all its difficulty, contained warmth and connection and ordinary human meaning. The rhythms we've traced together, rising and working, eating and resting, courting and marrying, birthing and dying, are rhythms that echo still, however transformed by the machinery of modern life. Your ancestors, whoever they were, wherever they lived, navigated similar cycles. They rose before dawn, they laboured, they loved their children, they worried about the future, and they lay down each night hoping for sleep and strength for another day. Let that thought be a thread connecting you to them across the years, not a burden of historical weight, but a simple recognition of shared humanity. They would understand your tiredness at day's end, your hope that tomorrow will be good, your need for rest, and perhaps, across the unbridgeable gulf of time, there is something like companionship in that understanding. The candle is out now, the house is still. Somewhere outside, the natural world continues its quiet business. Owls hunting, stars turning, seasons preparing their slow transitions. You need not think about any of it. You need only let your breathing deepen, your muscles soften, your mind release its hold on wakefulness. Rest now, traveller. You have walked far tonight through a world both strange and familiar. The morning will come, as it always does, but the morning is not your concern, for now there is only this, the comfort of wherever you are lying, the gentle weight of whatever covers you, the darkness that asks nothing of you but surrender. Sleep well, dream if you however must, but let the dreams be gentle ones, soft as candlelight, warm as a well-banked fire.